They were never meant to survive. Yet that was the first lesson every medieval child learned. Behind quiet villages lay stories of hunger, punishment, and childhoods erased before they could form. What seemed ordinary back then now feels unthinkable, hidden beneath centuries of silence and routine. Tonight we walk through that world, step by step, as their shadows rise again. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were to step inside a medieval birthing room, the first thing they would notice is not the mother, nor the midwife, but the air itself, thick, sewer, and unmoving. The room was usually a cramped corner of a house, closed tightly to keep out spirits. Yet in doing so, it trapped every odour, every breath, and every particle of dust. The walls were darkened by smoke from years of cooking fires, and the floor was layered with old straw, meant to absorb blood and fluids. It was changed only when someone remembered or had enough strength to do so, which was rare. Even the midwife's hands, stained by earlier births and wiped only on her apron, carried more danger than comfort. The space looked familiar and practical to those who lived in it. But beneath that familiarity lay hazards no one saw or understood. Birth was treated as a domestic event, something that belonged in the dim back room of a house rather than in the care of someone trained to prevent infection. Women gathered around the mother, touching her, lifting her, holding her steady, all without washing their hands because no one believed it mattered. The tools were simple: a knife, a cloth, a wooden bowl, and objects used earlier in the day for chores entirely unrelated to childbirth. When labour dragged on, sweat dripped from the mother, mixing with dirt that had settled on her skin, and the fluids that soaked into the straw spread outward like dark stains that no one dared look at too long. Disease hid in every corner, yet people saw only the miracle of birth, not the quiet threats lurking beside it. The newborn emerged into this setting with no protection, no sterile cloth, no clean surface, no understanding of germs. The child's first breath often carried the dust of the room, and its first touch came from hands that had just handled firewood, food, or animals. The midwife might give the baby a quick wipe with a cloth that had been used many times before, then pass it to the mother as if that simple gesture ensured safety. But the risks began from the moment the umbilical cord was cut with a blade, rinsed only in cold water. If at all, even a healthy child faced danger that no one could see, and families accepted this danger as part of life, because they had nothing else to compare it to. Illness struck quickly. Infants cried weakly, unable to feed, their bodies fighting invisible infections that spread fast through their fragile systems. A fever might appear one night and take their breath by morning. Mothers watched helplessly, believing the child had been born weak or cursed, never suspecting that the room itself, the very place meant to welcome new life, was responsible. Doctors were rarely present, and even when they were, they knew little about contamination. Advice centered on herbs, prayers, and rituals, not cleanliness. When a child died, grief was expressed quietly, but no one looked for a reason beyond fate or divine will. The mortality rate was so high that many families hesitated to name their newborns immediately. A child who survived a few weeks was seen as promising. One who reached a year was considered fortunate. In many homes, tiny graves stood behind the house or near the churchyard, forming a silent backdrop to daily routines. These losses became part of the landscape, accepted the way people accepted storms or cold winters. Death was not mysterious. It was familiar, expected, woven into the rhythm of family life. What makes this world unsettling is how normal it seemed to those who lived in it. A birthing room with rotting straw, unwashed tools, and stale air was simply the way things were. No one questioned why so many newborns died. They believed the child failed, or God decided otherwise. Not that the environment itself was quietly lethal. The idea that cleanliness could save lives belonged to another era entirely. To them, a cramped room filled with shadows, whispers, and the smell of blood was the natural setting for birth. If we compare this to today, it would resemble bringing a child into a room where someone had just butchered an animal, with the same surface used for both tasks, and no one thinking it improper. The thought is alarming now, but for medieval families it was ordinary, familiar, and unquestioned. The fragility of infants was a burden mothers carried, without understanding why their children slipped away so easily. They did not know that infection, not fate, was claiming them. The customs surrounding birth reflected deeper truths about medieval life. Most families struggled to survive on limited resources. Their homes were small, dark, and crowded. Clean water was a luxury, not something to waste on washing tools or hands. Illness was everywhere, and people believed that invisible forces, not hygiene, governed life and death. Without knowledge of germs, they approached childbirth with courage and resignation, hoping for the best while enduring the worst. Some mothers died alongside their infants, leaving families shattered yet unsurprised. The cycle repeated with each generation, shaped by poverty, illiteracy, and ignorance. It is difficult to imagine standing in that room, watching a newborn gasp its first breaths while surrounded by hazards no one recognized. The dimness, the quiet pressure of worried faces, the smell of sweat and straw, all formed a backdrop to the most vulnerable moment of life. A child who survived was seen as strong, not lucky, and families clung to that belief to ease their fears. But the truth was simpler and far more tragic. Survival depended less on strength and more on a dangerous environment that no one understood. The birthing room embodied the contradictions of the medieval world. People cherished children, yet brought them into conditions that endangered them. They valued life deeply, yet accepted preventable death as fate. They held on to traditions that comforted them, even when those traditions quietly caused harm. To them, there was no alternative. To us, the scene reveals how fragile infancy truly was, and how little protection newborns received, despite the love surrounding them. The moment a baby cried, families felt relief and hope, unaware of the uncertainties waiting just beyond that sound. For many children, the struggle to survive began long before they took their first steps. It began the instant they entered a world unprepared to keep them alive. Their lives were shaped by forces they could not see, and by practices their families followed faithfully without understanding the cost. Life began in darkness, shaped by customs that offered comfort but little safety. And each cry carried both hope and risk. Hidden dangers waited beyond the warmth of that small room, tracing paths no one around them could name. And among those unseen paths lay the first signs of challenges that would haunt their earliest days. Childhood in medieval life was not a season of safety, but a stretch of constant threat, and children understood this long before they understood anything else. Each morning began with the same quiet uncertainty, because illness, hunger, or an unexpected accident could alter a family within hours. The adults did not speak of danger directly, yet every routine, every gesture of caution, every hurried glance told children that survival demanded attention, not innocence. They learned early that the world around them was not gentle. It was crowded with sickness, hard labor, and losses that arrived without warning. And the weight of these realities shaped their lives from the moment they could walk. The home itself offered little protection. Floors were hard-packed earth scattered with sharp debris. Cooking fires burned constantly, and water buckets were easy for small hands to reach, but impossible to lift safely. Infants who crawled near the hearth risked burns. Toddlers who wandered too close to animals risked being kicked or bitten. Most families could not afford the luxury of watching their children closely, so danger lurked in ordinary corners. A fall, a fever, or a simple cut could turn lethal with startling speed. Children grew up watching others succumb to these hazards. And even if they did not fully understand the reasons, they remembered the fear that followed. Illness was the most common threat. Fevers swept through neighborhoods, and families lost children so frequently that mourning became a quiet, unspoken part of community life. A child who showed signs of weakness, or fatigue, vomiting, difficulty breathing, was often considered doomed. Mothers tried herbs, prayers, or charms, but these were gestures of hope rather than tools of healing. Medical knowledge was inconsistent, and many believed disease came from bad air or divine punishment, rather than contaminated water or poor nutrition. Children internalized this uncertainty. They learned not to trust their own bodies, which could betray them without warning. Hunger was another lesson they met early. Food supplies fluctuated with weather, harvests, and war, and the youngest members of a family were often the first to feel the shortage. Children learned to ration scraps, swallow discomfort, and accept emptiness as part of life. They watched adults divide portions unequally, favoring those who worked, and they understood the logic even if it stung. A child who complained too often or begged too loudly risked punishment, because patience was expected and need was constant. In households where survival overshadowed affection, children adapted quickly or suffered the consequences. Death was not distant. It lived inside the house, in the cradle that had been used by 3 infants, but only 1 had lived. In the cloth, the mother kept to wrap the ones who did not survive, and in the small graves marked by stones behind the church. Children saw these graves during chores or walks, and they knew their names could be added to them at any time. This awareness settled into their behavior. They matured early not because they wanted to, but because they saw what happened to those who didn't. The idea of a long future never rooted itself firmly in their minds. Life was measured in days, not years. Violence shaped much of their learning as well. Discipline was harsh, and mistakes were met with physical consequences. Adults believed pain was instruction, not cruelty. And children grew to accept this logic. A misstep could lead to a strike across the back or a beating administered in full view of siblings. The lesson was simple. To survive, one must obey quickly, listen carefully, and avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Even within their own homes, children lived under rules that offered little room for error. If we compare this to today, it would resemble raising a child in a place where every errand, every sip of water, every step outdoors carried the risk of injury or death, and where warning a child was less important than teaching them to endure whatever harm arrived. Modern discomfort would not even approach what was expected of them. Yet medieval children did not see their lives as cruel. They saw them as unavoidable. Their resilience was built through repeated exposure to hardship, not encouragement. They learned from the expressions of adults, from the silences around the dinner table, and from the sudden absence of familiar faces. They watched older siblings take on adult roles as soon as their bodies allowed it, and they understood that their own turn would come quickly. Even play, when it happened, was brief and cautious, overshadowed by the day's tasks and the next day's uncertainties. The world treated childhood not as a protected stage, but as an early test, a filtering point between those who could endure and those who could not. And families, stretched thin by labour and poverty, were unable to soften this reality. Children became observers of suffering long before they could name it, and participants in their own struggle for survival before they understood the meaning of loss. Their days were shaped not by wonder, but by vigilance. Because danger did not wait for them to grow older, children moved through each day knowing that safety was fragile, and they learned to read danger in every corner. Hardship pressed them forward long before they were ready, shaping their habits and their fears. And beyond those early lessons waited truths even harsher than the ones they faced inside their homes. Infant death was not an interruption in medieval life, but a constant presence woven into the rhythm of every household. Families greeted each birth with a mixture of hope and fear, knowing well that the child's chances of reaching its 5th year were no better than a coin toss. The numbers were accepted quietly. 1 in 3 children slipped away before they had learned to speak clearly, before their bodies had time to grow strong enough to withstand the world around them. This reality shaped how families loved, how they grieved, and how they planned their futures. Because no one assumed a child was safe simply because they were born. Illness moved quickly among young children. Fever rose without warning. Diarrhea drained infants of what little strength they possessed. And infections spread through villages long before anyone recognized the symptoms. Water sources were polluted by livestock and household waste. Yet they remained the only option for drinking, washing, and cooking. A child who drank from a contaminated bucket might fall sick by nightfall. The smallest discomfort, a cough, a rash, a refusal to eat, could signal a decline that no amount of care could reverse. Parents watched helplessly as their children weakened, because the idea of preventing illness was still beyond the understanding of most households. Food scarcity deepened the danger. Many families lived from harvest to harvest, and even in good years, their diets consisted mostly of coarse bread, thin broth, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Protein was reserved for adults who worked the fields or handled heavy labor, leaving children to eat the leftovers of an already limited supply. Malnutrition wore down their bodies, making them vulnerable to diseases that a healthier child might have survived. In the winter months, when supplies thinned and sickness spread easily, families often braced themselves for losses they could not prevent. Each cold season carried the same unspoken question: who would still be alive when spring returned? The absence of medical understanding ensured that most childhood deaths were met with confusion. Families created explanations of their own, such as evil spirits, bad luck, a curse, or the will of God, because they lacked the knowledge to identify the real causes. Remedies varied from herbal mixtures to whispered chants, none of which targeted the underlying dangers. Midwives and healers did what they could, but their tools were limited, and their advice often rested on superstition rather than evidence. Children died not because families did not care, but because care itself was powerless against disease. The emotional burden was profound, yet grief did not always appear in ways recognizable today. Many families, knowing how fragile life was, held a measured distance from newborns until they showed signs of surviving. Naming a child too soon felt risky, as if giving them an identity might tempt fate to take them away. Parents loved their children, but they also braced themselves for the possibility of loss, shaping a kind of protective numbness that allowed them to continue functioning in a world that demanded constant labor. Their sorrow was quiet, subdued, and often hidden beneath daily responsibilities. Larger families became a practical response to these harsh conditions. Parents had more children not because they were indifferent to loss, but because experience taught them that not all would live. Each birth was a fragile hope, an attempt to secure the future of the household, to ensure there would be hands to work the land, care for aging parents, or inherit the family's small possessions. Children were both precious and vulnerable, treasured and expendable in the eyes of survival. This contradiction shaped the structure of medieval family life. blending affection with resignation. Communities supported one another through these losses in ways both subtle and communal. Neighbours helped dig graves. Women brought comfort to grieving mothers. And prayers were offered at small altars in the home or at church. Yet the cycle continued relentlessly. One funeral was followed by another, and families adjusted to the rhythm of life and death as if it were a natural pattern. The sadness never left, but it softened into something familiar, woven into the fabric of ordinary days. If we compare this to today, it would be like living in a world where every household expected at least one empty chair, where parents entered each year wondering which child might not reach the next. Modern medicine has made such losses rare, yet medieval families endured them constantly, shaping a resilience forged through repeated grief. What now feels unimaginable was once the ordinary landscape of childhood. The inevitability of death shaped how children understood their own existence. They saw siblings fall ill, neighbours disappear, and small graves appear at the edge of the churchyard. They learned early that life could be brief, that strength did not guarantee survival, and that the world offered no protection simply because they were young. These lessons settled into their behaviour, making them cautious, obedient, and older than their years. Their innocence was eroded not by intention, but by the persistent presence of mortality. What lingers most about this reality is its quiet acceptance. Medieval families faced death not because they were indifferent, but because they lacked the means to fight it. They lived in conditions shaped by poverty, poor sanitation, and limited knowledge, and they carried their losses with solemn endurance. Each child who survived was a testament to luck as much as resilience, and each child who died became part of a pattern too familiar to question. Families learned to hold hope lightly, knowing how easily it slipped from their hands. The world around them offered little mercy, pressing its weight onto the smallest shoulders. What waited beyond those early graves carried shadows they had not yet begun to understand. Children in medieval society stepped into the world with no cushion of innocence to soften their earliest years. From the moment they were able to stand upright, they were expected to behave with the composure and restraint of adults who had already learned to survive hardship. The idea of childhood as a protected stage of life did not exist. Instead, children were folded into the structure of the household as additional labour, additional responsibility, and additional risk. Adults rarely adjusted their behaviour to accommodate a child's needs. It was the child who adjusted. Quickly, quietly, and without question, expectations settled on them early. A child was not encouraged to explore, dream, or express curiosity. Too many questions were seen as a sign of defiance rather than intelligence. Proper conduct mattered more than imagination. Children learned to lower their voices, to control their expressions, and mirror the seriousness of the adults around them. A wandering gaze could be interpreted as disrespect. A moment of hesitation might be labelled laziness. They watched their parents' movements closely and copied them, hoping to avoid scrutiny in a home that demanded maturity from bodies that had not yet finished growing. Their tasks reinforced this adult-like identity. By the age of 4 or 5, children carried water, fed animals, tended small fires, or swept the floors. Older siblings supervised younger ones with the same authority parents used, creating a hierarchy in which age mattered less than responsibility. Play existed, but it slipped into the day only during rare pauses between chores. Even then, play often resembled work, lifting stones, imitating tool use, pretending to herd animals, because those images shaped their world more powerfully than toys ever could. Discipline filled the gaps left by instruction. Medieval upbringing relied heavily on correction rather than guidance. A child who misbehaved faced swift punishment, a slap, a strike with a switch, or hours of kneeling on hard ground. These responses were not considered harsh. They were seen as essential for moulding character. Adults believed firmly that strict discipline produced strong individuals, capable of enduring suffering without complaint. Any display of childish behavior, crying, whining, or clumsiness was treated as a failure to meet expectations. Children grew up under constant pressure to prove they were worthy of survival. Inside the home, children absorbed adult concerns long before they understood them. They heard conversations about illness, bills, harvest failures, or lost livestock, and they learned to measure their own behavior against these tensions. A mistake made during a difficult season carried heavier consequences. Silence became a strategy, obedience became a shield, and emotional restraint became an instinct. Children did not have the luxury of being carefree because the household itself offered no room for softness. Outside the home, the same expectations followed them. In churches, children stood beside adults during long services, keeping still despite fatigue. In fields, they mimicked adult movements to keep pace with the work. In markets, they observed the behavior of grown men and women and shaped their own conduct accordingly. A child who appeared too playful risked being scolded not only by their family but by any adult who happened to notice. Society treated all children as unfinished adults whose purpose was to grow into usefulness, not to pass through years of protected learning. If we compare this to today, it would be like expecting a 6-year-old to sit through formal meetings without moving, to manage household duties with no mistakes, or to endure physical punishment for the smallest slip. Many modern ideas, such as emotional development, mental health, and the need for guidance, had no place in medieval thought. Strength mattered more than sensitivity, and obedience mattered more than understanding. Girls bore an additional layer of expectation. From a young age, they learned to stand modestly, speak softly, and avoid drawing attention. Their training centered on skills that defined their future roles: spinning, weaving, carrying water, and preparing food. Boys received lessons that prepared them for the fields, the workshop, or military service. Both were treated as apprentices to adulthood, not as children who needed time to grow. Failure to meet these expectations brought consequences that shaped not only their bodies but their sense of self. The emotional impact of this world settled deeply within them. Children learned not to cry easily, not to hesitate, not to ask for comfort. They learned to accept commands without protest. They absorbed the belief that their value depended on how well they imitated maturity. Over time, this expectation blurred the line between child and adult so thoroughly that many forgot the difference. They adopted adult burdens because they never experienced anything else. What remains most striking is how normal this seemed to everyone around them. No one questioned the demands placed on children. No one wondered whether they needed rest, emotional support, or protection from harsh punishment. Childhood, as we understand it now, simply did not exist. Life required strength, and medieval culture shaped children into that mold with relentless consistency. Children were shaped to stand firm long before they understood the weight placed on their shoulders. Expectations rose around them faster than their bodies could grow. A deeper strain waited in the tasks that would soon claim their earliest strength. Work settled into a child's life almost as soon as they could stand steadily, leaving little room for hesitation and none for refusal. A child between 5 and 7 was no longer treated as someone learning about the world, but as someone expected to contribute to it. Their hands were small, their steps unsteady, yet the demands placed upon them matched those of adults who had endured years of labor. Each day began with tasks waiting to be done, and every task carried the weight of necessity. In households where survival depended on collective effort, even the youngest members were folded into the rhythm of work before they understood why it mattered so much. The home itself acted as their first workplace. Children fed animals, carried water, swept floors, gathered firewood, and tended to siblings who were scarcely younger than themselves. These chores were not presented as training or preparation. They were simply obligations, expected to be completed without complaint. A child who lagged or performed poorly risked reprimands that stung more deeply than physical punishment, because they revealed the disappointment of adults who relied on them. In families living on narrow margins, idleness was a luxury no one could afford, and children learned this truth early. Outside the home, the demands grew heavier. Boys accompanied fathers into the fields, where they learned to handle tools that were too large for their hands and too heavy for their bodies. They watched the pace of adult labor and struggled to match it, their bodies straining under expectations far beyond their strength. Girls learned to spin, weave, mend clothing, and prepare meals, their days filled with repetitive work that left little room for rest. Tasks were taught quickly and corrected harshly. Precision mattered, speed mattered, and usefulness mattered. Childhood did not. Apprenticeship marked another path, especially for boys. A child as young as 7 might be sent to live with a master craftsman, leaving home with little more than a bundle of clothes and the hope that discipline, hunger, and exhaustion would eventually turn into skill. In workshops, children swept floors, prepared materials, and performed tedious tasks that adults avoided. Their mistakes brought scolding or cuffs to the back of the head, and their successes brought nothing more than permission to continue. The arrangement was seen as an opportunity, not as a hardship, because it promised future stability, though at a cost few children fully grasped. Girls faced their own form of apprenticeship within the household. Their mothers and older sisters served as instructors, guiding them through tasks that seemed simple from a distance, but required precision and endurance. Threading needles, grinding grain, stirring heavy pots, washing garments in cold water. Each task shaped their bodies and routines. They learned to work with quiet efficiency, knowing that any display of fatigue might be interpreted as weakness. Productivity was praised, while slowness or clumsiness led to rebuke. These lessons sank deep, forming habits that lasted well into adulthood. The pressure to contribute shaped how children viewed themselves. Work was not an interruption of childhood. It was the structure around which their entire identity formed. They evaluated their worth not by imagination or curiosity, but by productivity. A child who struggled physically or mentally was at risk of being labelled useless, a term that carried heavy consequences in a world where every hand counted. This judgment did not remain in the household, it spread through the community. Neighbours noticed who worked hard and who faltered, and reputations solidified long before a child reached adolescence. If we compare this to today, it would resemble asking a small child to manage farm equipment, care for younger siblings full-time, or perform workshop tasks meant for trained adults. Modern ideas about development, education, and emotional well-being would have seemed irrelevant in medieval life. The urgency of labour overshadowed everything else, leaving children with little room to grow outside the boundaries of necessity. Their skills improved quickly, not because they were gifted learners, but because survival demanded competence at an age when modern children are still discovering the world through play. The environment reinforced this expectation at every turn. Tools were always within reach. Chores were always present, and reminders of responsibility echoed constantly in the home. Play, when it occurred, often sprouted between tasks rather than interrupting them. A group of children might run briefly through a field before returning to their duties, their laughter fading quickly as work reclaimed their attention. Rest existed only in the margins of the day, overshadowed by what still needed to be done. The emotional toll of such early labour remained largely unspoken. Children who grew tired hid it behind determination. Children who felt overwhelmed learned to endure it quietly. Adults rarely offered praise, because work was expected, not celebrated. Any softness risked undermining the discipline needed to maintain a household on limited resources. Children internalized this silence, shaping a sense of self built on endurance rather than affection. Labor shaped their bodies as well. Muscles hardened early, joints stiffened prematurely, and injuries accumulated without proper care. A cut from a tool, a burn from a hearth, or a fall during a chore became part of daily life. Few families had access to skilled healers, so children learned to continue working through discomfort. Their growing bodies adapted to strain rather than rest, often leading to lifelong ailments. Yet, in a world where everyone worked until their bodies failed, this seemed ordinary. Beneath these demands lay a deeper truth. Medieval society valued children for their contributions, not their potential. Usefulness outweighed tenderness, and expectations rose faster than their bodies could mature. The line between childhood and adulthood blurred until it nearly vanished, leaving children to navigate a world that offered responsibility without protection. Labor claimed its early years, shaping them long before they reached full strength. Duty pressed into their daily routines with a weight they had no choice but to carry. Further burdens waited ahead, tightening around their lives in ways they could not yet foresee. The weight placed on children in medieval life pressed onto them long before their bodies were ready to carry it. A child's hands, still soft and unsteady, closed around tools meant for adults, not toys. Those hands learned to grip a hoe, lift a bucket, or sweep a hearth with the same seriousness expected of grown men and women. There was no gentleness carved into these tasks, no allowances for small mistakes, because every chore contributed directly to the survival of the household. Childhood existed only as a brief physical stage, never as a protected period of learning or play. Duty seeped into their bones before they understood the meaning of duty itself. A child's error, no matter how small, could ignite frustration in adults who carried the burdens of labor, hunger, and fear of disease. A dropped pot, a forgotten chore, a spill on the floor. These were treated not as harmless mishaps, but as disruptions that threatened the family's fragile stability. Corrections came swiftly, often delivered through physical punishment rather than explanation. A strike across the back, a slap to the hands, hours spent kneeling on cold ground. These were common responses, believed necessary to shape obedience. Adults rarely questioned these methods. They saw discipline not as a harsh choice, but as the only reliable tool for ensuring survival in a world that punished weakness without mercy. Children internalized these lessons quickly. They learned that silence was safer than curiosity, that precision mattered more than understanding, and that their bodies would bear the consequences of any misstep. Hunger became another form of discipline, used when words or blows seemed insufficient. A child who failed to complete a task might be denied a meal, reinforcing the message that survival hinged on usefulness. In households where food was already scarce, the fear of hunger cut deeper than any physical punishment, teaching obedience in ways that lingered far longer than bruises. Roles within the home expanded rapidly as children grew. Boys were expected to master physical tasks, handling tools too heavy for their frames and laboring beside adults whose endurance had been built over decades. They pushed their bodies through long hours, their muscles straining under weights they were never meant to carry so young. Girls learned to manage domestic responsibilities that demanded constant attention, stirring heavy pots, grinding grain, and washing clothes in cold water. Each chore required focus and stamina, and mistakes invited reprimand. There was no room for clumsiness, no space for fatigue. Children learned to swallow discomfort and hide exhaustion to avoid punishment. Within this environment, affection often took a muted form. Parents cared deeply for their children, yet survival overshadowed tenderness. Worry expressed as anger, fear masked as strictness, and love translated into relentless expectations. Adults hoped that discipline would protect their children from the dangers of the world. But the methods they relied on created a different kind of hardship. Children grew accustomed to carrying emotional burdens alongside physical ones, learning to endure quietly rather than seek comfort. They believed strength meant silence, and silence meant safety. If we compare this to today, it resembles placing a modern child in a setting where any misstep invites consequences severe enough to reshape their behavior instantly, where tools replace toys, and where fear of punishment shapes daily routines more strongly than encouragement. The boundary between instruction and coercion, between training and harm, would be unmistakable now. Yet in medieval society, these practices blended seamlessly into ordinary life. They were neither questioned nor hidden, because they were considered essential. The pressure to perform shaped how children understood their own value. Productivity became the measure of worth, and resilience became the measure of character. A child who hesitated or showed weakness risked being labelled incapable, a judgment that followed them for years. Communities observed children as closely as parents did, reinforcing expectations that left little room for individuality. Those who excelled were praised for their discipline, while those who faltered faced scrutiny or shame. In this environment, childhood became a trial rather than a journey. Over time, the body adapted to these demands, but not without cost. Early labor left lingering injuries, strained joints, weakened muscles, and chronic pain that followed children into adulthood. Many learned to ignore their discomfort, treating it as a natural consequence of living. The cycle repeated across generations. Adults who had endured hardship imposed the same on their children, convinced that anything less would leave them unprepared for a world that offered no leniency. Despite the harshness, children found brief moments to breathe. A quiet second by the water bucket, a shared glance between siblings, a pause during chores when no one was watching. These fleeting spaces allowed them to exist as children, even if only for a heartbeat. Yet the return to labor came quickly, pulling them back into routines that cared little for their youth. Survival left no room for gentler alternatives. The most striking part of this world is not the severity of the tasks or the punishment, but how natural it all appeared to the people living in it. No one questioned why a child carried a hoe instead of a toy, or why discipline relied on force rather than conversation. The culture around them accepted these conditions as necessary, shaping expectations so deeply that they felt like truth rather than tradition. Children learned to bear responsibilities that belonged to adults, not because anyone believed it was ideal, but because no other path seemed possible. Children stepped into burdens far heavier than their small bodies could manage, and each day pressed new demands into their fading sense of youth. Harsh lessons settled into their routines with quiet permanence. Greater pressures waited nearby, tightening their lives in ways that pulled them further from any notion of innocence. Food in a medieval household rarely offered comfort, and for children, it seldom provided enough strength to meet the demands placed on them. Meals were predictable, not because they were satisfying, but because poverty allowed for little variation. Most days began with coarse bread that crumbled easily, its rough texture scraping against the teeth of children whose bodies needed far more than it could offer. Thin porridge appeared at nearly every meal, stretching a small amount of grain into something that resembled nourishment but delivered little. Vegetables, when available, were often wilted or bland, grown in soil that had long been exhausted and carried no guarantee of nutritional value. These foods filled the stomach just enough to keep hunger from becoming unbearable, but not enough to support growth, energy, or health. Meat was a luxury that hovered outside the reach of most families. Children watched animals in the yard: goats, pigs, chickens, knowing they were to be sold or bred, not eaten. Slaughtering one for food was reserved for the rarest occasions, moments tied to religious festivals or desperate need. Even then, The best portions went to adults whose labor sustained the household, leaving children to pick at bones or chew on fatty scraps. Fish could be an alternative, but inland households often found it too costly or too difficult to obtain before it spoiled. As a result, children grew up without the protein their bodies needed, their development slowed by a diet that barely kept them alive. Hunger sat beside them constantly. It tightened their stomachs while they worked. It followed them into sleep. And it woke them in the early hours with a familiar ache. This hunger was not the sharp pain of missing a meal, but a dull, persistent presence that shaped how they moved and thought. Children learned to eat slowly, stretching small pieces of bread as far as they could. They learned to ignore the weakness in their limbs, pushing through chores even when their bodies trembled from lack of sustenance. They learned to be grateful for food that satisfied them for only a moment. Hunger became a companion as constant as discipline, woven into their daily lives with quiet inevitability. Scarcity made every meal a negotiation. Parents divided food carefully, calculating who needed more strength to perform the day's labor. Older siblings often received slightly larger portions, while younger ones waited with hope that something would remain. A child who ate too quickly or took more than their share risked punishment, because mismanaging food threatened the entire household. Even crumbs carried importance. Children scoured plates and bowls after meals, licking whatever residue remained. Not out of greed, but out of necessity. Waste was unthinkable, and satiety was rare. During harsh seasons, the situation deteriorated further. Winters reduced harvest stores, forcing families to rely on dried grains, old vegetables, and whatever scraps they had preserved. Children ate bread, hardened by cold and porridge thinned with water to make it last. Illness spread easily during these months, and weakened bodies struggled to fight infection. In years of crop failure or extended drought, hunger transformed into desperation. Families mixed ground bark or weeds into their food to stretch supplies. Children learned the bitter taste of these substitutes, swallowing them with quiet resignation. If we compare this to today, it would resemble feeding a child nothing more than stale bread and diluted broth for weeks at a time, expecting them to work long hours with the faint hope that their bodies would somehow keep up. Modern standards of nutrition feel distant in a world where survival overshadows health. Children did not count calories or balance meals. They counted whether there was enough to get through the day. The idea of fullness existed mostly as a memory or imagination, never as a reality. Malnutrition shaped their bodies and minds. Growth slowed, bones weakened, and energy faded quickly. Children grew thinner than their frames could support, their faces hollowing earlier than expected. Their concentration wavered, yet they continued to work because work was unavoidable. Illness struck them more easily, and recovery took far longer than their families could afford. Some children became so accustomed to hunger that they no longer complained, believing it inseparable from life itself. Their silence came not from acceptance, but from fatigue. The emotional toll deepened as they watched adults manage the same struggles. Parents often hid their own hunger, giving portions to children when possible, though rarely enough to make a difference. Siblings shared scraps, offering pieces of bread that were too small to divide, but too meaningful to ignore. These gestures softened the hardship, but never removed it. Food remained a source of both unity and tension, binding families together while reminding them of their limits. Every meal reinforced the fragility of their existence. A slight shortage of grain, an unexpected illness in livestock, a storm that damaged stored supplies. Any of these could send a household into crisis. Children lived with this uncertainty without fully understanding it, sensing only the fear that crept into adult voices when stores ran low. They learned to eat whatever was given, to accept hunger as ordinary, and to continue working even when their bodies begged for rest. The contrast between their needs and their resources shaped childhood into something brittle. Strength was rarely developed fully, and health remained precarious. Yet expectations did not lessen. Children were still required to labor, obey, and endure. Their hunger became part of the background of life, unnoticed by those who experienced it daily, but unmistakable to anyone who stepped into their world from outside. Meals offered little more than brief pauses in the struggle to stay alive, and hunger threaded itself into every task they carried out. Their bodies strained against constant deprivation. Deeper hardships circled these young lives, waiting to reveal themselves as the demands of survival grew heavier. Scarcity deepened into something far harsher whenever a village entered the stretch between harvests or found itself caught in the path of war. Children felt this shift first, long before adults allowed themselves to acknowledge it. Meals that were already meager shrank further, until bowls held nothing more than thin porridge mixed with whatever filler could be scraped together. In some homes, families stirred sawdust or ground bark into their food to keep hunger from overwhelming them. Not because they believed it was nourishing, but because it offered the illusion of fullness. The taste was sharp, earthy, and difficult to swallow. Yet children learned quickly that refusing food was not an option. Crop failure turned entire communities into places of silent desperation. Fields that once promised grain stood barren after storms. Droughts, or pests. Parents walked through them with tight expressions, calculating how long their stores might last and how much could be stretched if they rationed carefully. Children overheard these murmured conversations, even if they pretended not to. They sensed the tension in every bowl of weakened porridge, in every glance exchanged across the table. Hunger no longer hid in the corners of daily life, it filled the entire room. During these harsh months, children searched for anything edible outside the home. Some peeled the soft inner layers of tree bark, chewing it slowly to ease the ache in their stomachs. Others collected insects, roasting them lightly over small fires or eating them raw when fuel was scarce. Such diets did little to sustain them, but they delayed starvation just enough to continue working. The instinct to survive pushed them into these acts, even when fear or disgust lingered in their minds. Watching children forage in this way struck outsiders as shocking. Yet, within the village, it was accepted with quiet sorrow. War magnified this desperation. Armies moving through the countryside seized crops, animals, and stored supplies, leaving families with empty cellars and no means of replacing what had been taken. Soldiers trampled fields, burned homes, and stripped barns clean. Children faced hunger not because of poor harvests, but because conflict had consumed the resources that would have kept them alive. They watched plumes of smoke rise from neighboring settlements, understanding that each one meant fewer places left untouched by scarcity. In the worst situations, families made decisions that carved deep wounds into their histories. A household with too many mouths to feed faced the possibility of losing everyone if food ran out. Faced with this terror, some parents chose to reduce the number of dependents they had to support. Children, especially the youngest or those considered least useful, might be sent away, sold into servitude, or given to wealthier households where labor was exchanged for survival. These choices were not made lightly. They tore families apart, leaving gaps that never fully healed. Yet parents, trapped by hunger, convinced themselves it was the only path forward. Children who were sold entered a life shaped entirely by the needs of others. They worked long hours for masters who viewed them as property rather than individuals. Some found relative stability, though never comfort. Others encountered cruelty that far exceeded the hardships of their original homes. Families rarely learned what became of them, carrying the loss silently, grieving, regretting, and attempting to survive the guilt that pressed against them with the same weight as the hunger that forced the decision. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a community where empty shelves and failing crops pushed families to consider impossible choices. where children combed forests for anything edible, where hunger shaped every conversation and stripped away plans. Modern safety nets, food distribution, medical care, and protective laws did not exist to soften these blows. Survival relied entirely on what a family could find: trade or sacrifice. Children bore these realities without understanding the wider forces that shaped them. The emotional impact of scarcity carved itself deeply into their behavior. Children learned to eat quickly when food was available, to hide small scraps for later, and to pretend they were full so younger siblings might receive a little more. They watched their parents' faces for signs of worsening conditions, reading fear in the tightness around their mouths or the tremor in their hands. Silence accompanied most meals, not because families lacked love, but because speaking openly about hunger felt too dangerous, as if acknowledging it might make conditions worse. Scarcity also reshaped social bonds within the community. Neighbors who once shared resources grew guarded, closing doors and concealing what little they had. Trust frayed as families competed quietly for survival. Children sensed this shift, noticing when familiar faces became distant or when hospitality disappeared. Yet even in these moments, small acts of kindness persisted. An older child slipping a crust of bread into the hands of a younger friend. A mother sending a spoonful of porridge to a neighbor whose children were visibly weaker. These gestures softened the harshness, but never overcame it fully. Over time, hunger became a defining memory for many children, shaping how they viewed the world long after the crisis passed. It taught them caution, discipline, endurance, and fear. It taught them that life could change abruptly, that safety was fragile, and that the needs of the body often overshadowed anything resembling joy. Scarcity pressed into every corner of their lives, leaving little space for comfort. And each day, survival measured more than growth. Choices sharpened under pressure, carving paths that reshaped families forever. Deeper losses hovered near, waiting for their moment to alter childhood yet again. Education in medieval society existed as a narrow path reserved for those born into privilege, leaving most children to grow up without ever holding a written word in their hands. Learning was not viewed as a universal right, but as a mark of status, a boundary that separated the powerful from the ordinary. For noble children, or those destined for the church, literacy became part of their identity, woven into their schedules alongside prayer, etiquette, and preparation for leadership. For everyone else, the idea of schooling felt distant, almost irrelevant, because daily survival demanded labor, not learning. Children absorbed this hierarchy instinctively, recognizing that knowledge belonged to others long before they understood what it meant. In most households, books were rare objects, costly to produce, and inaccessible to families whose lives revolved around work and scarcity. A child growing up in such a home might never see a page of script or understand that letters carried meaning. Their world was built through sound rather than sight, shaped by the voices of parents, neighbors, and elders who passed down stories, instructions, and traditions orally. Information moved through memory rather than ink. What a child learned depended entirely on who spoke to them, what tasks they were assigned, and what fragments of wisdom filtered through the daily noise of survival. Children watched noble families from a distance, seeing their sons guided by tutors and their daughters taught to read psalms or household accounts. These glimpses reinforced the distinction between classes. Education marked a lineage rather than an individual mind. The idea that a poor child might attend lessons or own a book felt unimaginable. Instead, their learning occurred in the fields, the workshop, or the home, where every task taught them something practical, but nothing that expanded their understanding beyond immediate necessity. Intelligence became measured not by curiosity but by obedience and skill. Illiteracy was not viewed as a failing. It was the expected condition of life for the majority. Adults who had never learned to read guided their children naturally toward the same fate. They taught them how to plant grain, mend tools, prepare food, and recite prayers they did not fully understand. Knowledge became an inheritance built through repetition and imitation. A child learned to count, not by numbers written on a page, but by sorting vegetables, stacking firewood, or measuring grain for bread. These skills sustained the household, but they left little room for imagination or broader thought. Without access to reading, children depended entirely on spoken words to understand the world. Stories, warnings, and rules traveled through villages like invisible threads connecting generations. Misunderstandings spread just as easily. Superstitions blurred into accepted truths because there was no written reference to challenge them. Children believed what they were told, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked alternatives. Their world remained contained within the boundaries of familiar voices, never widening into the possibilities that literacy might have offered. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a society where books, schools, and written communication existed only for a select few, while everyone else lived without the ability to read signs, follow written instructions, or record their own thoughts. The gap between privilege and poverty would widen quickly, leaving children defined from birth by the opportunities they could never reach. Modern ideas about universal education, personal development, and lifelong learning would feel foreign in a world where a child's future rested solely on their family's social standing. The absence of formal schooling shaped how children understood their place in society. Those who could not read saw themselves as fundamentally different from those who could, often believing that literacy required talents they lacked rather than opportunities they were denied. This perception solidified social divisions. Noble children grew up confident in their ability to influence decisions, while poorer children accepted their roles as labourers, apprentices, or servants. Their ambitions narrowed long before they reached adolescence. Illiteracy carried practical consequences as well. Children who could not read contracts, instructions, or religious texts were vulnerable to manipulation. They relied on others to interpret information for them, placing their trust in people who might not have their best interests in mind. This dependence echoed through adulthood, shaping marriages, trades, and disputes. A misunderstood agreement or a misheard instruction could alter the course of a life. Yet no one questioned this imbalance, because it had been built into society for generations. Despite this, children developed their own forms of intelligence. They memorized stories with extraordinary precision, learned to navigate landscapes by subtle cues, and mastered tactile skills that required focus and discipline. Their lack of literacy did not mean a lack of ability, but their strengths remained hidden from the eyes of those who judged worth by written knowledge. Their futures unfolded within narrow limits, defined more by what they were denied than by what they possessed. Some children glimpsed literacy through chance encounters. A visiting monk, a merchant with a ledger, a scrap of parchment thrown away by a scribe. These moments stirred something quiet within them, a sense that words might unlock a world beyond their own. Yet such sparks rarely grew. Without access to instruction, they faded like embers in the wind, leaving children to continue along the paths laid out for them by custom and circumstance. The divide between those who learned from books and those who learned from survival shaped medieval life in ways both obvious and invisible. It maintained class structures, limited mobility, and preserved systems of authority that kept knowledge tightly guarded. Children, at the bottom of this hierarchy, did not question why they were excluded. They simply lived within the boundaries they were given. Knowledge remained out of reach for most children, guided instead by the fragments passed from one voice to another, and their futures narrowed before they knew they had choices. Opportunities stayed locked behind doors that they would never open. Greater pressures loomed ahead. waiting to shape their lives with even heavier expectations. Literacy, in the medieval world, stood like a guarded gate, visible to all, yet opened only for a chosen few. Children born outside noble or religious circles learned early that books were not meant for their hands, that written words belonged to people of higher standing. They grew up watching others read with an ease that felt almost supernatural, as if deciphering marks on a page required a kind of power that ordinary families would never possess. A child might spend an entire lifetime without touching a single book, not because they lacked curiosity, but because society had quietly placed knowledge far beyond their reach. In most households, reading was unnecessary for survival. Work filled every hour of the day, and the skills needed to keep a family alive passed from parent to child through spoken instruction. Stories, warnings, and customs travelled through memory rather than parchment. A child learned to obey commands, repeat prayers, and follow routines long before they understood that written language could store ideas far more reliably than human recollection. For them, knowledge did not exist in libraries or scrolls. It lived in voices, fading or shifting with each retelling. Children observed how differently the world treated those who could read. Nobles displayed books as symbols of refinement, their shelves holding volumes copied by scribes who spent years perfecting scripts. Priests used text to instruct congregations, their authority strengthened by the words they alone could interpret. Merchants kept ledgers that determined prices, debts, and agreements. For a medieval child, witnessing these scenes made literacy seem less like a skill and more like a mark that separated the powerful from the powerless. The ability to read meant influence, and influence meant survival in ways that labor alone could never guarantee. Parents reinforced this divide, though often unintentionally. They taught their children to follow directions without question, reminding them that obedience was safer than curiosity. A child who asked about letters or symbols received no clear answers, because the adults themselves had grown up believing such knowledge was irrelevant to their lives. In their view, the world was structured in ways that could not be changed. Some people were meant to guide, and others were meant to follow. Literacy belonged firmly in the realm of those who guided. Children who worked in markets or workshops encountered writing occasionally, in signs, tallies, or scraps of discarded parchment. These fragments stirred curiosity, but offered no path forward, without someone to teach them. Letters remained mysterious shapes, unfamiliar and unreachable. The gap between seeing words and understanding them stretched wider with time, creating a subtle sense of exclusion that they could neither name nor challenge. They recognized the importance of reading, yet knew instinctively that it was not meant for them. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a world where books and education existed openly, but only a narrow group could access them, while everyone else lived entirely dependent on spoken instructions. Children would grow up knowing that reading unlocked opportunities, yet be denied every tool needed to learn. Such a structure would feel deeply unfair now, but in medieval society it was accepted without question. Privilege was destiny, and destiny did not bend to ambition. The belief that reading indicated high status carried social consequences that shaped how children viewed themselves. A literate person could settle disputes, conduct trade, interpret religious doctrine, or negotiate with officials. An illiterate child, by contrast, looked to others for guidance, even in adulthood. This dependence often limited their opportunities and made them vulnerable to exploitation. Written contracts could be manipulated, measurements could be misread aloud. Promises recorded on parchment held power that spoken words could not match. A child who grew up without literacy stepped into adulthood already disadvantaged. Even so, knowledge moved through communities in quieter ways. Children learned from songs, proverbs, stories, and shared memories. They understood their environment intimately: weather, crops, tools, and social expectations. Their intelligence developed through experience rather than textbooks. Yet their abilities remained undervalued because society defined worth by the written word. They might master complex tasks, interpret subtle changes in nature, or manage household duties with precision. But these accomplishments did not grant them status. Without literacy, their contributions remained invisible to those who shaped laws and customs. In rare cases, a child encountered someone willing to share small fragments of reading, an aging monk who pitied them, a travelling merchant with patience, or a distant relative who had joined a monastery and brought home glimpses of the world beyond. These moments felt extraordinary but fleeting. Without sustained instruction or materials, early sparks of interest faded quickly. Life demanded labour, not learning, and any attempt to pursue reading independently conflicted with the household's needs. The few children who managed to rise above these restrictions often did so through extraordinary circumstances: adoption by religious institutions, service in noble houses, or chance encounters with education. Their stories were remembered precisely because they were exceptional, not typical. They highlighted how deeply literacy was tied to privilege, reinforcing the idea that knowledge flowed downward only when the powerful allowed it. For the vast majority, childhood passed without written words. They learned to navigate life through instinct, observation, and obedience. They understood that the ability to read altered one's place in society, yet understood equally that the door to literacy remained locked. Their futures narrowed accordingly, shaped more by social expectation than by personal potential. Knowledge hovered just beyond their grasp, visible yet restricted, leaving childhood shaped by limits they could not escape. Understanding stayed confined to spoken lessons passed from one generation to the next. Further strains gathered at the edges of their lives, ready to press more heavily on them as they grew. Marriage for girls in medieval society arrived not as a choice, but as an expectation pressed upon them long before their bodies or minds were prepared for it. Families viewed daughters as part of the household's limited resources, assets to be arranged carefully in hopes of securing alliances, stability, or relief from financial strain. A girl might barely reach 12 years old before hearing her future decided in quiet conversations she was not invited to join. She listened from corners of the room, sensing the weight of words that would reshape her life. The adults around her spoke about dowries, land, and obligations as if discussing livestock or tools, not a child who still learned her way through daily tasks. Once a marriage arrangement was set, the girl's path narrowed quickly. Her time shifted from play or simple chores to lessons meant to prepare her for a household she had never seen. Adults corrected her posture, her speech, her movements, reminding her that she now carried the reputation of two families. She absorbed these instructions silently, not because she understood them fully, but because she recognized the seriousness in the voices guiding her. Her childhood was shortened into a brief transition period, a space where she was expected to shed youth without ever having lived it freely. Decisions were made around her rather than with her. A girl's preferences held no weight in negotiations because marriage served economic and social needs, not personal desires. Families believed this structure protected stability, even when it placed impossible burdens on the young. Girls who attempted to resist were met with firm reminders that obedience was their duty. Their futures belonged to the agreements forged by adults, and questioning those agreements threatened the fragile balance that households depended on. In this system, silence became a survival strategy. Once married, the responsibilities pressed onto a young girl intensified rapidly. She was expected to manage unfamiliar tasks, obey unfamiliar elders, and adapt to expectations she had never been prepared to meet. Her body, still developing, was treated as ready for childbirth simply because tradition deemed it so. Pregnancy often followed soon after marriage, not out of choice, but because producing heirs was viewed as her primary purpose. The risks carried by these early pregnancies were well known, yet rarely spoken about. Girls entered this phase with little understanding of the dangers ahead. Childbirth posed the greatest threat. A young girl's body struggled under the strain, and complications emerged frequently. Infection, exhaustion, and obstructed labor claimed many lives, leaving families to mourn outcomes they had expected but never addressed directly. Mothers, aunts, and midwives assisted as best as they could, yet their knowledge could not overcome the limitations of medical understanding. The death of a young bride in childbirth was mourned, but rarely questioned. It was framed as fate rather than a preventable tragedy. If we compare this to today, it would resemble sending a child barely entering adolescence into a legally binding partnership, expecting her to bear the physical, emotional, and social responsibilities of adulthood immediately. Modern protections against forced marriage and underage pregnancy did not exist in medieval society. Survival depended on alliances, inheritance, and labor, not personal well-being. Girls became part of this system by default, shaped by customs that valued their compliance over their safety. The emotional turmoil they endured rarely appeared in written records, yet it lived quietly in the spaces between daily tasks. A girl leaving her childhood home often carried fear more than excitement. She stepped across thresholds with uncertainty, clutching memories rather than hopes. Her new household expected competency, devotion, and submission, leaving little room for confusion or mistakes. Any hesitation could be interpreted as weakness or defiance, pushing her further into isolation. Some girls attempted to adapt by imitating the behaviors of older women, learning to navigate expectations that shifted without warning. They adopted a sense of adult restraint quickly, because showing vulnerability offered no protection. Others retreated inward, performing tasks mechanically while trying to preserve fragments of identity in private moments. Whispered conversations with other young wives or servants provided brief comfort, though these connections were fragile and easily lost. Families justified these practices by claiming they ensured continuity and stability. A girl who produced heirs secured the lineage. A girl who obeyed her husband preserved harmony. A girl who accepted her place avoided bringing shame to her relatives. These expectations ignored her youth and fragility, binding her to roles that disregarded her emotional development. The community viewed success through the survival of the household, not the well-being of the individual. Even when a girl survived childbirth and fulfilled her expected duties, the strain left lasting marks. Her body aged prematurely from repeated pregnancies. Her confidence eroded under constant pressure to meet standards she had never chosen. Her ability to imagine a different life faded as years passed. She became an adult not through growth, but through a sacrifice imposed too early. Those who died young, whether from childbirth or the exhaustion of unending responsibilities, left behind stories that remained unspoken. Their absence became another quiet reminder of the risks woven into the fabric of medieval life. Families mourned, yet the system continued unchanged, shaping the futures of countless girls in the same way. Marriage arrived long before girls understood its weight, binding them to expectations far larger than their years could carry. Their futures narrowed into obligations they never chose. Shadows deepened around these young lives, preparing to reveal even harsher demands as they entered a world shaped by conflict and duty. Training for boys in medieval society began not with gentle lessons or playful exploration, but with the strict discipline expected of future warriors. From an early age, their routines shifted toward tasks designed to harden their bodies and shape their instincts. Wooden swords were placed in their hands long before they understood the weight of real weapons, and older men demonstrated stances, strikes, and defenses with the expectation that the boys would imitate them without hesitation. These drills continued daily, even when fatigue blurred their vision or cold stiffened their fingers. Childhood, for them, unfolded under the shadow of violence. The culture surrounding them reinforced this path at every turn. Tales of heroic battles and noble sacrifices echoed through households, shaping expectations long before the boys could question them. Fathers, uncles, and older brothers reminded them that skill in combat determined not only personal survival, but also the safety of the community. Boys listened quietly, absorbing the notion that courage mattered more than fear, and that hesitation on the battlefield endangered everyone. These lessons did not allow for uncertainty. Every mistake was corrected sharply, ensuring that discipline took root deeply. As training intensified, physical hardship became a constant companion. Boys practiced in harsh weather, their hands blistering from repeated strikes against wooden posts or shields. Bruises spread across their arms and ribs, accepted as unavoidable signs of progress. They learned to ignore the sting of cuts and the ache of strained muscles, because showing discomfort drew reprimands that implied a lack of potential. Endurance became a measure of worth. Pain was treated as something to push through, not something to acknowledge. Over time, the boys grew quieter about their injuries, recognizing that resilience mattered more than honesty. Weapons training expanded as they aged. Wooden swords gave way to dull blades, and shields grew heavier. Archery drills demanded precision. Each missed target prompted another round until their arms trembled. They learned to handle spears, axes, and other tools of war, guided by adults who had survived battles themselves. The gap between training and real combat narrowed, leaving the boys with an understanding that their bodies would eventually be tested in ways no practice session could replicate. If we compare this to today, it would resemble placing young adolescents into programs where physical strain, exhaustion, and exposure to violence were routine expectations, preparing them for conflicts they did not choose. Modern protections against child soldiers did not exist, and neither did broad condemnations of the practice. Instead, communities believed they were building defenders, individuals who would protect land, family, and honor. Childhood became a preparation for war rather than a space for growth. Mental conditioning accompanied physical training. Boys were told repeatedly that bravery defined manhood, that fear was a flaw, and that dying honorably was preferable to living in shame. These ideas settled heavily on their young minds, shaping how they viewed themselves and others. Some internalized the expectations quickly, suppressing their anxieties and adopting the stoic demeanor encouraged by their elders. Others struggled quietly, wondering if they were capable of meeting the demands placed on them. Expressing doubt, however, was rarely tolerated. Communities reinforced these beliefs during ceremonies, gatherings, and festivals. Warriors returning from battle received praise, gifts, and admiration. Their scars were displayed proudly, symbols of dedication rather than reminders of trauma. Boys watched these scenes with a mix of awe and apprehension, sensing both the rewards and the sacrifices expected of them. Stories of soldiers who died in defense of their homeland were told reverently, creating a narrative where death for the community was portrayed as meaningful, even desirable. Not all boys embraced this path willingly. Some carried internal resistance, unsure why they were expected to risk their lives for conflicts they could barely comprehend. Yet social pressure left little room for refusal. Families relied on able-bodied sons for protection and status. A boy who resisted training jeopardized not only himself, but also his relatives. Such behavior was seen as weakness or disobedience, prompting correction rather than understanding. In this environment, compliance became the safest choice. As boys neared adulthood, the prospect of actual combat loomed larger. They trained alongside men who had already experienced the chaos of battle, listening to stories that blended pride with a quiet acknowledgement of loss. These tales rarely included fear, trauma, or hesitation. Instead, they emphasized survival, duty, and the importance of discipline. Boys internalized these messages, believing that stepping onto a battlefield was an inevitable step in their lives. The transition from training to combat often arrived abruptly. A raid, a territorial dispute, or a call for reinforcements could pull young men into conflict before they felt ready. In these moments, their years of preparation collided with the unpredictable reality of warfare. Noise, confusion, and fear surrounded them, challenging every lesson they had absorbed. Some survived and returned home with hardened expressions, their childhoods erased by what they had witnessed. Others never returned at all, their deaths framed as honorable contributions to the community. Adults mourned quietly, but also spoke of the boys' bravery, reinforcing the belief that such sacrifices upheld the stability of society. Those who remained continued training, understanding that war did not wait for them to reach emotional maturity. Childhood simply ended the moment conflict demanded their participation. Expectations tightened around them from the moment they could lift a weapon, shaping their futures before they realized how little choice they had. Strength became their measure of worth, and hesitation held no space in the path carved for them. Further demands gathered ahead, ready to push these young lives into harsher trials they could not avoid. Discipline in medieval households operated through methods that left little room for gentleness or negotiation. Children grew up understanding that mistakes, disobedience, or even perceived disrespect could provoke physical punishment without warning. Adults used force as their primary tool for correction, shaped by long-standing beliefs that pain created obedience more effectively than guidance. A child might be struck for dropping a tool, tied for wandering away from chores, or denied food for failing to meet expectations. These punishments were not viewed as excessive. They were considered necessary, even virtuous, because a well-disciplined child reflected honor on the family. The tools of discipline varied depending on the household. Some families favored switches cut from nearby trees, their thin branches capable of delivering stinging blows that left red marks across arms and legs. Others used belts, wooden rods, or ropes. Children often learned to recognize the sound of these objects being prepared, a quiet signal that correction was imminent. They also learned to anticipate punishment by observing subtle shifts in adult expressions. Tightened jaws, clipped words, or the silence that often preceded anger. Fear became woven into their daily routines, shaping how they moved, spoke, and behaved. Punishments extended beyond beatings. Tying a child to a post or beam was common, restricting movement for hours at a time. The immobility caused muscle cramps and deep discomfort. Yet adults viewed this as a lesson in stillness and obedience. Some children were made to kneel on rough surfaces, stones, wooden planks, or grain kernels, until their knees swelled or bled. Others were locked in small storage areas or corners of barns, left alone without light or comfort until adults believed the lesson had been learned. Hunger was also used deliberately, with children denied meals when they failed to meet expectations. These methods inflicted both physical and emotional strain. Yet none were considered unusual. The consequences of such punishments could be severe. Bruises, cuts, and broken skin often went untreated, increasing the risk of infection. A harsh blow to the head or back might cause long-term disability, though adults rarely acknowledge these outcomes as preventable. Some children developed permanent injuries, limps, stiffness, or chronic pain from repeated beatings or forced postures. Others faced outcomes far more tragic. A punishment delivered in anger could escalate quickly, resulting in unconsciousness or death. Communities mourned these losses quietly, but did little to challenge the norms that caused them. If we compare this to today, It would resemble an environment where physical harm against children was not only tolerated but encouraged, where there were no laws, authorities, or institutions to intervene. Modern expectations of child protection, emotional safety, and developmental understanding hold no parallel in a world where punishment served as the primary form of instruction. In medieval society, adults believed they were shaping stronger, more obedient individuals, not causing harm. Their intentions reflected the cultural norms of the time, but those norms carried consequences that reshaped young lives permanently. Children internalized these threats quickly. They learned to anticipate demands and avoid mistakes, altering their movements to prevent drawing attention. Some became hypervigilant, scanning rooms and faces for signs of brewing tension. Others withdrew inward, speaking less and showing little emotion to avoid provoking punishment. These coping mechanisms allowed them to survive, but hindered their ability to develop trust, curiosity, or confidence. The fear shaped them long after the bruises faded. Families often justified harsh discipline through tradition. Adults claimed they were raised the same way and had survived, a perspective that ignored the lingering trauma carried in silence. Religious interpretations reinforced these beliefs, with some households citing virtue in breaking a child's will to ensure moral strength. These ideas spread through generations, creating a cycle where violence became normalized. Even children who vowed privately never to treat their own offspring harshly often adopted the same behaviors when they reached adulthood, convinced that discipline required force because they had never experienced alternatives. In many cases, punishments were triggered not by serious wrongdoing, but by stress, exhaustion, or frustration in adults. A child might face physical correction simply because a crop failed, an argument erupted, or illness weighed on a household. Children became outlets for misplaced anger, absorbing tension that had little to do with their actions. They learned to remain quiet during moments of adult distress, knowing any misstep could result in severe consequences. The absence of legal protection left children vulnerable to these dynamics. There were no established guidelines for acceptable discipline, no institutions overseeing welfare, and no recourse for those who suffered excessive harm. A child's pain remained confined within the household, unnoticed by broader society unless it resulted in death. Even then, responsibility was seldom questioned. Neighbors expressed sympathy, but rarely condemnation, because they viewed punishment as a private matter. Despite these hardships, children developed resilience in ways that modern perspectives might struggle to comprehend. They learned to soothe their own fear, to endure pain without breaking, and to seek small moments of comfort where they could find them. Bonds formed quietly among siblings who shared punishments, supporting one another with whispered reassurances or hidden scraps of food. These connections offered brief relief from an environment dominated by discipline. Over time, the cumulative weight of punishment shaped a child's understanding of the world. They interpreted authority as something to fear rather than respect. They viewed mistakes as threats, not opportunities to learn. They learned obedience, but at the cost of self-expression. Their futures unfolded under the lingering influence of this early conditioning, affecting how they navigated relationships, responsibilities, and conflicts throughout adulthood. Discipline carved itself into their bodies and memories, leaving marks that shaped how they moved through life. Fear guided their choices more than instruction ever could. Deeper challenges waited ahead, prepared to confront these young lives with harsher uncertainties they could not foresee. Punishment in medieval households did not wait for serious wrongdoing. Even the smallest misstep could trigger a response far more brutal than the act itself. Children grew up knowing that habits like chewing a fingernail, breaking a small household item, or speaking an unwelcome truth could unleash anger that left them bruised, bleeding, or unable to walk for days. Adults believed these reactions were justified, a necessary correction to ensure discipline. The fragility of the mistake did not matter. What mattered was control, and the fear that built obedience more effectively than any lesson spoken aloud. Every day of life became a landscape full of hidden traps. A child might accidentally drop a clay bowl or spill water while carrying a jug, and the sound of the breaking object signaled a punishment already forming in the adult's mind. The child often froze, understanding that running would worsen the outcome. Yet staying meant submitting to blows delivered with belts, rods, or whatever object happened to be within reach. Their bodies learned to absorb pain silently, because crying too loudly could be interpreted as disrespect. Punishment escalated not because of the mistake, but because of the reaction to it. Harsh methods extended beyond beating. Some adults hung children by their ankles, leaving them suspended and disoriented while blood rushed to their heads. Others forced them to kneel on rough stones until their legs shook and their skin split. These punishments lasted minutes or hours, depending on the household's temperament. The purpose was not to teach a skill or correct behavior through explanation. It was to instill fear deep enough that the child would hesitate before making the same mistake again. In many homes, fear became the primary language of instruction. Children quickly adapted to these expectations. They moved slowly, avoided sudden gestures, and watched adults carefully to gauge their moods. A slammed door or a raised voice could trigger panic. They learned to hide small errors, sweeping broken pieces under furniture or quietly repairing damaged objects using whatever materials they could find. The instinct to conceal mistakes became a survival strategy, reinforcing secrecy rather than trust. Household rules differed widely, but the underlying principle remained the same. A child's value depended on obedience, not innocence. Adults did not view themselves as cruel. They believed they were shaping strong individuals capable of hard work and moral fortitude. The idea of correcting behavior with patience or explanation did not exist in most families. Education meant imposing consequences, severe enough that children learned to avoid the same action out of fear. Pain was considered an effective teacher, one that left clear physical reminders. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a world where minor childhood habits triggered punishments severe enough to require medical attention, where no authority stepped in to protect the vulnerable, and where adults saw fear as the cornerstone of raising a child. Modern understandings of psychological harm had no place in medieval life. There were no concepts of trauma, emotional development, or long-term impact. Adults believed that a child who survived harsh discipline would grow into a responsible adult. Whether the child survived physically or emotionally was another matter entirely. The effects of these punishments extended beyond the moment they occurred. Children learned to anticipate violence in everyday gestures, bracing their bodies when an adult reached for an object or raised a hand. Their relationships with adults became shaped by caution rather than connection. They offered respect because fear demanded it, not because they felt admiration. Over time, some internalized the belief that they deserved punishment, interpreting harsh treatment as a reflection of personal failure. In households with multiple children, older siblings often tried to shield younger ones from the worst punishments. They intercepted tasks that carried a greater risk of error or quietly corrected mistakes before adults noticed. These small acts of protection offered brief relief, but could not eliminate the overarching threat. The fear of punishment permeated the entire home, lingering even during peaceful moments. Children rarely relaxed, because they knew tranquility could shatter quickly. Punishments also shaped how children interacted with one another. Fear bred caution, and caution bred distance. Friendships formed quietly, with little room for open affection. Even play carried risk. A loud noise or accidental injury could draw adult attention and result in collective punishment. Some children avoided play entirely, choosing tasks that allowed them to stay out of sight. Their world shrank into manageable spaces, where they felt slightly safer. When punishment resulted in lasting injury, families adapted by necessity rather than compassion. A child who limped from a broken bone or struggled to lift objects due to damaged muscles simply learned to complete chores differently. Adults rarely apologized or acknowledged that the harm was preventable. They believed outcomes were part of the lesson, reinforcing the notion that suffering was a natural part of childhood. In extreme cases, where punishment led to death, the tragedy was framed as unfortunate but not criminal. The community grieved, but no systems existed to intervene or prevent recurrence. Children internalized these norms, carrying them into adulthood and often repeating the same methods with their own offspring. Violence became generational not because individuals desired it, but because they had no alternative framework for raising children. Fear was the foundation upon which households were built, shaping not only childhood, but the entire structure of family life. Through these conditions, children learned to navigate a world that punished them for being young, inexperienced, or imperfect. They adjusted their behavior to minimize risk. But the threat never disappeared. It became a constant presence, shaping how they viewed themselves and the adults responsible for their care. Small mistakes held the power to unravel their safety, turning moments of childhood clumsiness into experiences marked by pain. Their lives tightened under rules that allowed no room for error. New strains waited just ahead. Casting longer shadows over the fragile path these children were forced to follow. Illness surrounded medieval children like an invisible fog, settling into every corner of their daily lives. They breathed air circulated through cramped homes, shared crowded sleeping spaces, and drank water drawn from sources easily contaminated by waste or stagnation. With no antibiotics and no trained physicians beyond the limited knowledge of local healers, a simple case of chills or a mild cough could quickly turn into a fatal condition. Families accepted this fragility as part of life, even when it claimed the youngest and weakest among them without warning. Common ailments struck with unnerving frequency. A child might wake with a sore throat in the morning and struggle to breathe by nightfall. Fever rose rapidly, burning through their small bodies without resistance. Diarrhea spread quickly through villages, often carried by spoiled food or unclean water, draining strength from children who were already malnourished. A sudden cold could escalate into pneumonia, tightening their lungs until they could no longer draw breath. These illnesses required no dramatic event to begin. They arrived quietly, growing severe, before adults realized how serious the condition had become. Many families responded to sickness with home remedies passed down through generations. Mothers mixed herbs, applied heated cloths, or whispered prayers believed to offer protection. Some treatments provided comfort, but others caused more harm than relief, driven by misunderstandings about how illness worked. Without scientific knowledge, parents relied on repetition rather than evidence. They used poultices, charms, or rituals that offered emotional reassurance, but rarely improved the child's condition. When symptoms worsened, families could only watch, powerless to intervene. Communities leaned heavily on superstition to fill the gaps left by medical uncertainty. Seizures or unusual behavior were often interpreted as signs of possession or divine punishment. Children who suffered from epilepsy or mental illness were treated with fear and suspicion, their conditions misunderstood as threats rather than health issues. Some were isolated or subjected to rituals intended to drive out perceived evil forces. In these moments, fear replaced compassion, leaving the child alone in their suffering. Contagion spread easily because households lacked the means to contain infection. People shared tools, food, sleeping areas, and clothing. Waste disposal systems were rudimentary at best, allowing disease to linger in the environment. Insects and rodents moved freely between homes, carrying sickness with them. Even when families recognized the risk of spreading illness, they had few options. Isolation required space and resources that they did not possess. As a result, a single sick child could unintentionally set off a chain of infections that swept through the entire village. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a world without hospitals, medication, clean water systems, or public health knowledge. A minor infection would carry the same danger as a severe disease. Parents would depend solely on superstition, hearsay, or improvised remedies. The idea of medical intervention, vaccines, antibiotics, and professional diagnosis would feel like an impossible luxury. Children who fell ill would have little more than hope to rely on. The emotional toll of constant illness left deep marks on families. Parents learned not to grow too confident when a child showed signs of recovery. Because relapses were common and frequently fatal, they mourned silently, often without ceremony. Because grief occurred so frequently that it risked overwhelming the entire household. Siblings learned to help care for the sick, wiping foreheads, fetching water, or sitting quietly beside beds, too small for the weight they carried. These scenes became part of ordinary life, shaping how children understood mortality long before they could fully grasp the concept. For many children, sickness blended into their memories of home. They remembered the smell of damp cloths, the sound of coughing echoing through shared rooms, and the sight of adults whispering anxiously near hearth fires. They watched neighbours gather outside homes marked by illness, offering assistance while bracing themselves against fear. They saw how quickly rumours spread about outbreaks, prompting families to keep children indoors or avoid certain wells. Fear settled into the rhythms of daily life, influencing decisions about work, travel, and social gatherings. Chronic illness also limited children's futures. Weakness from repeated infections stunted growth, restricted stamina, and reduced their ability to perform labour expected of them. A child recovering from severe sickness might fall behind in tasks, drawing criticism rather than sympathy. Adults, preoccupied with survival, often lacked the capacity to adjust expectations. Children learned to push themselves even when their bodies rebelled, because falling behind threatened both their safety and their place in the household. Despite these hardships, communities developed informal systems of care. Neighbours brought broth or water, elders shared herbal mixtures, and local healers moved from house to house, offering what guidance they could. These acts provided moments of relief, though they rarely altered the course of serious disease. The support created bonds across families, reminding children that even in a world filled with suffering, compassion still appeared in small gestures. Deaths from illness occurred so frequently that burial rituals became a familiar presence. Children regularly saw small graves added to churchyards, each one marking a life that illness had claimed swiftly and quietly. These losses rarely led to lasting changes in health practices, because families lacked alternatives. They grieved briefly before returning to daily work, understanding that survival depended on maintaining the routines that illness continually threatened to disrupt. Over time, children came to accept sickness as a constant shadow, unpredictable yet unavoidable. They recognized its presence in the tired faces of adults, in the hollow expressions of siblings, and in the quiet preparations made when someone became too weak to rise from bed. Illness shaped their understanding of the world, teaching them that life could be interrupted without warning, and that comfort remained fragile. Disease surrounded them with a certainty they could neither avoid nor control, carving limits into their bodies and futures. Every breath carried a measure of risk. Darker hardships gathered ahead, ready to tighten the boundaries of childhood even more. War reshaped the lives of medieval children with a force far greater than anything they had encountered before, pulling them into dangers they could neither understand nor escape. When armies passed through villages, children became part of the conflict, whether they wished to or not. Some were taken immediately, pulled from their homes to serve as attendants or helpers for soldiers who needed extra hands. Others were pressed into roles far harsher, sent ahead as messengers, scouts, or decoys, placed in situations where hesitation could lead to death. Their small size, once a sign of youth, became something armies exploited without remorse. Conscription did not always come through official commands. Soldiers captured children during raids, selecting those who appeared strong enough to serve or quick enough to run messages. Families resisted desperately, but resistance often brought violence. Parents watched helplessly as children were dragged away, unable to protect them against armed men. For the children taken, the transition from home to battlefield happened within minutes. They stepped into the chaos without preparation, surrounded by shouting, weapons, and the harsh expectations of men who saw them as tools rather than individuals. Those used as pages or attendants carried out constant tasks, cleaning weapons, tending fires, fetching water, and delivering commands across dangerous terrain. The slightest mistake invited punishment, because war left no room for error. Children sent as messengers faced the threat of arrows, ambushes, and sudden violence at every turn. They learned to run quickly, hide instinctively, and obey immediately. Their fear became a quiet companion, urging them forward even when exhaustion blurred their vision. Some children suffered roles far more brutal. Armies used them as bait, sending them ahead to draw enemy fire or to test whether an area was safe. These acts reflected the brutality of warfare and the disregard for young lives caught between opposing forces. Children who survived such missions carried memories that never faded. Moments of terror where survival relied on split-second decisions. Those who did not survive were rarely remembered. Their deaths became footnotes in battles that prioritized strategic gains over human cost. War also brought sweeping violence to the places children still tried to call home. Raids destroyed villages in minutes, setting fire to houses, slaughtering livestock, and killing anyone who resisted. Children were often unable to flee quickly enough. Many died in the chaos, lost beneath collapsing roofs, or struck down by soldiers who viewed everyone in their path as expendable. Others hid in fields or forests, listening to screams and the crackling of burning wood, waiting for silence to tell them whether they could emerge. Survivors of these attacks carried trauma that reshaped their understanding of the world. They returned to find their homes destroyed, their families gone, or their villages emptied. The loss of stability pushed them into wandering, seeking shelter with distant relatives, monasteries, or groups of refugees. Their grief mixed with fear, leaving them uncertain of where they belonged. In this state, many became vulnerable to capture by slave traders or hostile forces. Children taken as hostages faced a different kind of captivity. Rulers used them as bargaining tools, keeping them in foreign courts where their safety depended entirely on the political stability of distant lands. They lived carefully, knowing a broken treaty or a failed negotiation could end their lives. Others suffered more hidden forms of exploitation. Sexual violence, though rarely recorded, occurred frequently during wartime, leaving children exposed to harm that communities seldom acknowledged. Their suffering remained invisible, buried beneath the larger narratives of war. If we compare this to today, it would resemble a world where no laws protected children from military recruitment, where armies routinely captured minors for labor or strategic uses, and where entire communities lacked the means to shield their young from violence. Modern concepts of child rights, trauma care, and humanitarian protections had no equivalent. Children were simply absorbed into the machinery of conflict because war demanded bodies. Any bodies. Despite this, some children learned to navigate the horrors around them. They observed soldiers closely, understanding how to avoid drawing anger. They memorized escape routes and safe hiding places. They bonded with other children in similar circumstances, sharing whispered reassurances or scraps of food. These small connections offered fragile comfort in a world filled with danger. Yet survival did not erase what they had witnessed. It simply allowed them to carry those memories forward. On rare occasion, Children managed to return home after battles shifted or treaties were signed. Their families often greeted them with relief. But reunion could not restore what had been taken. The children had learned discipline through fear, caution through suffering, and silence through necessity. They struggled to reintegrate into daily routines, haunted by images of violence and loss. Adults expected them to resume ordinary tasks. Unaware of the emotional burdens they carried, war shaped childhood into something unrecognizable. It erased innocence, replacing it with vigilance and instinct. It taught children to view strangers as threats, loud noises as warnings, and nighttime as something to fear. Even after the conflict ended, the impact lingered, altering how they approached work, relationships, and responsibility for the rest of their lives. A generation raised amid violence carried the echoes of war long after the battles faded. Conflict pulled children into roles they never chose, forcing them to face dangers adults barely survived. Their lives narrowed into tasks shaped by fear and necessity. Present uncertainties pressed against them, preparing to lead these young lives into places where survival demanded even greater endurance. Labour for medieval children did not pause for their safety, their growth, or their inexperience. Work unfolded in places built for adults, under conditions shaped by necessity rather than protection. Mines to forge, tanneries, and workshops demanded constant effort. And children were pulled into these environments because their small bodies could reach spaces adults could not. They learned quickly that danger surrounded them, the heat of open flames, the weight of iron tools, the instability of tunnels, and the sharp edges of materials they barely understood how to handle. Accidents were not possibilities, they were inevitabilities. In mining settlements, children descended into narrow shafts carved deep into the earth. They crawled through gaps too tight for grown workers, carrying baskets of ore or clearing debris by hand. The air below was thick with dust, making every breath feel heavy. Walls shifted without warning, shedding stones that bruised or crushed small limbs. Collapses happened quietly, sometimes trapping a child in darkness the moment a support beam snapped. Rescue efforts rarely arrived quickly enough. Those who survived learned to accept constant risk as part of the job. In forges and blacksmith workshops, danger took a different form. Children worked near blazing furnaces, assisting smiths by pumping bellows, carrying heated metal, or fetching tools covered in soot and sparks. They moved carefully, knowing one misstep could send molten fragments across their skin. Burns were common, leaving scars that stretched across arms, hands, and faces. The heat pressed into their lungs, making breathing difficult after long shifts. Yet adults viewed these hardships as necessary preparation for the craft. A child expected to master metalwork needed to withstand the heat without complaint. Tanneries exposed children to harsh chemicals, slippery floors, and heavy hides that soaked up cold water until they weighed far more than the child lifting them. Tasks included scraping flesh from skins, stirring vats filled with mixtures that produced toxic fumes, and carrying materials that dripped with substances capable of burning the skin. Many children developed chronic respiratory issues, skin infections, or eye damage from the fumes and splashes. Their bodies adapted as best they could, but the environment continued wearing them down. None of these workplaces offered protective equipment. Gloves, masks, goggles, or reinforced clothing did not exist within their world. Children worked with bare hands, exposed faces, and thin garments inadequate for the conditions surrounding them. When sparks flew or tools slipped, their skin absorbed the impact. When chemicals spilled, their eyes and lungs bore the cost. Work demanded endurance, not comfort. Safety was rarely discussed. because families believed the work itself provided a path to survival. If we compare this to today, it would resemble sending children into industrial sites without training or equipment, expecting them to manage tasks that would challenge adults. There would be no regulations, no inspections, no relief for injuries, and no compensation for harm. The idea of enforcing safety standards or limiting child labour would feel completely alien. Medieval society saw children as contributors to household income or production, not as individuals needing protection. Accidents occurred frequently. A child might lose their balance while carrying ore and fall into a pit. Another might drop a heated tool, resulting in burns severe enough to limit the use of their hand. Metal shards could strike their eyes, blinding them instantly. Work did not pause for these injuries. The child either returned to labour after a brief rest or was replaced. Injuries became part of the landscape, visible reminders of the cost of survival. Adults acknowledged them, but rarely reconsidered the structure that caused them. Children tried to adapt, developing techniques to minimize danger even though they could never eliminate it. They learned to move quickly in tight spaces, to anticipate which tools were likely to slip, and to recognize subtle changes in the environment that signaled collapse or malfunction. Their awareness sharpened out of necessity. Yet even with skill and caution, risk remained constant. Physical limitations made it impossible for children to fully protect themselves from hazards. When injuries became too severe, families faced new burdens. A child who broke an arm or leg might struggle to contribute to household work for months. Medical care was limited, often handled by relatives with little knowledge beyond basic splinting or herbal remedies. Bones healed incorrectly, causing permanent deformities that limited future work. Blindness forced children into dependency in a society that offered no accommodations. The household absorbed these challenges quietly, reshaping expectations but never questioning the system that produced the harm. Emotionally, children carried fear into every shift. They understood that injury could occur at any moment. Yet they continued working because there was no alternative. Fear blended into routine, becoming part of the rhythm of labour. Some grew numb to the risks, treating accidents as normal. Others remained tense, flinching at sudden noises or movements near dangerous equipment. Their anxiety rarely drew adult attention, because emotional distress held no priority compared to physical productivity. These work environments shaped children's sense of self long before they reached adulthood. They measured their worth by endurance rather than skill. They learned to accept danger without protest, believing that suffering was an unavoidable part of life. They rarely imagined futures beyond these workplaces, because work consumed their time, their bodies, and their understanding of what life could be. Amid these conditions, small moments of camaraderie formed between children working side by side. They warned each other about unstable beams, hot surfaces, or slippery areas. They shared quiet glances when someone narrowly avoided injury, acknowledging fear without speaking it aloud. These fleeting connections offered brief comfort in environments otherwise dominated by tension. Work surrounded them with hazards they could neither control nor escape, carving early limits into their bodies and futures. Each shift carried risks that pressed heavily against their attempts to survive. Present challenges tightened around them, ready to push these young lives into even darker forms of hardship. Children in medieval labour systems carried responsibilities far heavier than their bodies were designed to bear. Their hands, small and unsteady, were expected to grip tools, haul loads, and navigate environments where even trained adults faced constant danger. When accidents occurred, and they occurred often, death arrived quickly, without ceremony or outrage. A child crushed beneath a collapsing mine wall, burned in a forge accident, or drowned while hauling water was not seen as a victim of preventable conditions. Their death folded quietly into the rhythm of daily life. treated as an unfortunate but ordinary part of a world built around survival rather than safety. Workplaces rarely paused when a child died. The tools they dropped were gathered, their tasks reassigned, and the routine continued without interruption. Families grieved as best they could, but grief approached silently, shadowed by the knowledge that work still needed to be done. The concept of a workplace accident did not exist. No investigations occurred, no officials visited, and no changes were implemented to prevent future harm. Adults spoke in hushed tones about fate, as though destiny had simply claimed another young life. This belief softened their guilt, but hardened the reality that nothing would change. Children who observed these deaths experienced a quiet, heavy fear that embedded itself deep within them. They saw how quickly a life could end, how swiftly a task could turn fatal. Yet the fear did not free them from responsibility. It pushed them into caution rather than resistance. They learned to move carefully, to memorize the sounds and shifts of their environment, to anticipate danger without drawing unwanted attention to themselves. Survival became a skill separate from the work itself. It was not enough to complete tasks. They had to understand how to avoid becoming the next unspoken tragedy. In many trades, adults relied on children because they believed youth offered flexibility, not fragility. Children could slip into narrow spaces, crawl beneath platforms, and carry loads that strained their joints. Their small size allowed them to maneuver equipment meant for adults, even when their strength barely met the demands. The mismatch between their capabilities and their responsibilities created risks that no one acknowledged. When a child collapsed from exhaustion or suffered an injury from overexertion, adults dismissed it as weakness rather than evidence of structural danger. If we compare this to today, it would resemble communities where children worked in hazardous industrial settings without any protections, where fatalities were treated as unavoidable, and where families had no recourse to demand safety improvements. Modern expectations of workplace regulation, compensation, and accountability would seem unimaginable. Medieval society offered no such frameworks. Work was simply work, and the bodies that performed it, whether young or old, were equally exposed to harm. Pressure to contribute economically intensified the risk. Many families relied on every member of the household to survive each season. A child's labor might provide essential income or reduce the burden on adults who managed the heaviest tasks. Families balanced necessity with danger, often choosing short-term survival over long-term well-being. Parents were not indifferent. They were trapped. They sent their children to work because hunger and poverty offered fewer alternatives than danger did. When tragedy struck, they mourned with the same depth of sorrow any family might feel. But their circumstances allowed little time for reflection. Children themselves rarely questioned the structure of their lives. They grew up surrounded by examples of others working from a young age, never encountering a world that offered safer paths. Their understanding of labor was formed through observation and imitation, not instruction or choice. The idea that childhood was meant for learning or growth rather than toil was unimaginable. They accepted responsibility early, believing it was part of who they were rather than something imposed on them. Death in the workplace also carried social implications. In some communities, a child who died while working was spoken of with resignation rather than outrage. Adults muttered phrases about fate or divine will, framing tragedy as part of life's unpredictable nature. This framing allowed communities to continue functioning, even as grief accumulated beneath the surface. Small memorials might appear, candles lit, prayers whispered, but the structure that caused the death remained intact. Life moved forward with quiet inevitability. Children who survived incidents often carried lingering injuries that shaped their futures. A crushed hand, a damaged eye, or a weakened leg could limit their ability to contribute to the household. These limitations were not seen as reasons to reduce expectations. Instead, children adapted by shifting to tasks that matched their altered capacities. pain became an accepted part of living. Chronic injuries remained untreated, deepening with age and shaping the next generation of laborers. Emotionally, the weight of this environment pressed heavily on young minds. Children learned to accept risks without protest because fear of punishment or hunger outweighed fear of death. They bonded with other children who shared the same dangers, forming brief alliances based on mutual recognition. They whispered warnings, shared techniques for avoiding hazards, and offered comfort when someone suffered harm. Yet these connections could not shield them from the broader structure that governed their lives. Over time, the normalization of danger shaped entire communities. Families adapted to the loss of children because they had no choice. Workplaces continued employing them because their labor was both useful and expected. The cycle repeated across generations, with little variation except for the particular tasks children were assigned. The weight of survival overshadowed the value of individual lives, especially those still in their earliest years. Their hands carried burdens far beyond their strength, shaped by labor that left no space for protection or refusal. Each day carried the possibility of sudden loss, accepted by those around them as an unchangeable truth. Shadows thickened around their path, hinting at deeper forces that would narrow childhood even further. Children in medieval households existed within a structure where obedience shaped every moment of their lives. Their parents held unquestioned authority, a level of control that extended far beyond daily routines and entered every decision. Expectation and future possibility. A child's will, preferences, or discomfort rarely carried weight. Life unfolded under a system where defiance was not simply discouraged, but treated as a violation of family order. From the earliest years, children learned that silence and compliance preserved stability, while hesitation or disagreement brought consequences they could not avoid. Parents guided their children with the belief that authority guaranteed survival. Families lived close to hunger, illness, conflict, and unpredictable hardship, creating an environment where individual expression seemed unnecessary and even dangerous. Because of this, a child's conduct became part of the domestic foundation, something adults believed must remain firm and unchallenged. Any sign of resistance was interpreted as a threat to discipline, as though a single argument or refusal could unravel the fragile balance that kept the household functioning. Obedience was not taught through discussion, but through reminders delivered with absolute certainty. If we compare this to modern expectations, it would resemble a world where children had no legal protection, no channels to express distress, and no recognition of personal boundaries. Parenting was shaped by survival rather than emotional development. Adults believed that their authority prepared children for the harshness of life beyond the home, where no softness awaited them. They viewed strict control not as cruelty, but as necessary preparation for a society that demanded endurance above all else. Under this framework, children learned to quiet their thoughts before they fully understood them. Rules governed almost every aspect of a child's day. Waking, eating, working, resting, and interacting followed patterns defined entirely by adults. A child who questioned these routines risked punishment, which could range from scolding to physical discipline, depending on the severity of the perceived offense. Even minor hesitation, moving too slowly, completing chores imperfectly, or showing reluctance could draw unwanted attention. Children adapted by anticipating expectations, shaping their behavior to match what adults required before those requirements were spoken. Silence often served as a defensive tool. Children learned to avoid offering opinions because opinions invited correction. They withheld complaints about exhaustion, hunger, or discomfort, knowing such complaints were seen as signs of weakness or disrespect. Instead, they followed instructions carefully, observing the reactions of adults and adjusting their actions to avoid conflict. Over time, they internalized these patterns so deeply that obedience became instinctual rather than deliberate. They learned to move through daily life with the smallest footprint possible. This environment created moments where affection and fear coexisted. Children understood that their parents cared for them, in the sense that survival depended on the family working as a unit. Yet that care did not shield them from discipline. Adults believed punishment strengthened character and ensured future stability. They saw obedience as the foundation of good behavior, respectable reputation, and religious duty. As a result, expressing individuality or disagreement felt both foreign and dangerous to children, who avoided stepping beyond the boundaries set for them. Consequences for disobedience varied by household, but the underlying message remained constant. Resistance carried risk. Some children faced isolation, with adults refusing to speak to them until they demonstrated remorse. Others faced physical punishment, which reinforced fear and compliance. In extreme cases, children who repeatedly challenged authority risked being sent away to apprenticeships or other households, not as opportunities, but as warnings. Being removed from the family meant losing familiarity, security, and the fragile stability of home. The psychological weight of this environment shaped childhood in ways that lingered far into adulthood. Children learned to suppress their emotions because emotional openness created vulnerability. They monitored their posture, tone, and reactions carefully to avoid drawing judgment. Even joyful moments required caution, as too much enthusiasm might be interpreted as a distraction from duties. Over time, many children forgot what spontaneous expression felt like. They lived within narrow limits, shaping themselves to match expectations rather than exploring who they might have been. Religious beliefs reinforced this structure. Many communities viewed parental authority as divinely sanctioned, teaching children that obedience aligned them with moral order. Stories, teachings, and rituals emphasized discipline, portraying compliance as a virtue rewarded in both life and the afterlife. This connection between faith and obedience strengthened the social expectation that children should not question decisions made for them. It transformed household rules into moral obligations, allowing no space for personal desires or opinions. Still, children found quiet ways to cope. They exchanged glances with siblings during difficult moments, offering wordless support. They formed silent routines that helped them endure tasks they disliked. They observed small traces of kindness, a lighter tone, a brief pause before punishment, and held on to them, recognizing them as the closest form of affection available. These subtle interactions provided rare comfort within a structure that demanded unwavering submission. Obedience shaped not only how children behaved, but also how they viewed their place in society. They learned early that authority flowed in one direction. When they eventually reached adulthood, many repeated the same patterns. Believing discipline upheld order, the cycle continued through generations, maintained by the belief that strict control preserved family stability in a harsh world. For medieval society, this belief felt reasonable, even necessary. Despite the emotional constraints it imposed on children, their days unfolded under rules that left little room for breath, shaping behavior long before understanding took form. Quiet acceptance became their shield against conflict. A heavier strain weighted within the expectations that governed their future roles, tightening the boundaries that defined their entire world. Play rarely existed as a natural or expected part of medieval daily life. The rhythm of each day centered on work, obedience, and the constant need to contribute to the household's survival. Leisure was not seen as a right, not encouraged, and certainly not understood as essential to childhood. Any moment lacking purpose made adults wary. A child who paused too long or behaved with too much ease risked being judged as careless. With this expectation firmly in place, the idea of extended play simply had no place to grow. The short intervals that resembled play usually appeared in the spaces between chores. These were narrow fragments of time, unpredictable and easily interrupted. A child might finish carrying water or gathering firewood a little bit early, and in that brief opening, attempt to create a simple distraction. Sticks, stones, scraps of wood, or any nearby object served as the basis for quick, improvised games. The activities tended to be repetitive because there was not enough time for anything more ambitious. Even light laughter was cautious, held back by the awareness that work could be assigned again at any moment. From an adult's point of view, idleness brought risk. A child who enjoys too much unstructured time might begin to question responsibilities or lose discipline. For that reason, households strongly discouraged anything that resembled relaxation. Tasks were assigned constantly, not always because they were needed, but because they kept the children controlled. A young person learned early that usefulness mattered more than joy. The more quickly this lesson settled, the better regarded the child became. Even during short pauses, children behaved with restraint. They monitored the movements of adults, listened for footsteps, and kept an ear tuned for their names being called. Their games were shaped by fear of interruption rather than the desire for fun. If an adult appeared, the transition from play to obedience occurred instantly. Objects used in games were dropped without hesitation, and the body returned to a posture of readiness. The sudden shifts in behavior became second nature, almost automatic. In public spaces such as alleys, fields, or the edges of small villages, children sometimes attempted slightly longer games. Still, these were controlled by the same pressures. They needed to remain close enough to respond to an adult's call and quiet enough not to attract unwanted attention. A child who appeared too excited or too energetic risked being ordered back to work. Any sign of enthusiasm could be misread as a lack of discipline. As a result, even spontaneous play was muted. The toys available reflected the same limitations. Few households possessed objects created solely for entertainment. Purpose-built toys required resources that families rarely had. Simple items crafted from leftover materials served instead. A carved stick might stand in for a tool. Bone pieces might be arranged in counting games, and stones could be used for throwing contests. These small items did not stimulate creative exploration. They simply filled the silence between chores. Even in seasonal festivals or community gatherings, moments that might offer escape from routine, children were not free to behave as they wished. They assisted adults, waited patiently, carried items, or stayed close to assigned areas. Enjoyment existed only through brief glimpses of movement when adults were distracted. Some children ran short distances before returning quickly, knowing that too much freedom drew suspicion. Inside, crowded living spaces, play opportunities shrank even more. Homes were tight and noisy, leaving little room for movement. Noise caused conflict, so children learned to occupy themselves silently. Sitting still for long stretches became a normal expectation. Activities, such as arranging small objects, tapping stones, or tracing lines into dirt, took the place of any meaningful recreation. These were quiet, controlled actions, designed to pass the time without disturbing the environment. The shift away from play deepened as children aged. Responsibilities increased, and any remnants of childhood leisure vanished. A 10-year-old performed sustained labor, often equal to that of adults. By the time adolescence arrived, work defined identity. Any memory of early games faded into the background, replaced by an understanding that leisure was not part of life's structure. The absence of play carried long-term effects. Children who learned to suppress curiosity and excitement often grew into adults who repeated the same expectations with their own families. The cycle stayed unbroken because it felt normal, not cruel. Daily survival required productivity, and productivity outweighed everything else. Play seemed unnecessary, even dangerous. in a world where every individual needed to contribute constantly. The denial of leisure reflected broader social values. Work ensured stability, discipline ensured order, and obedience ensured survival. A child who challenged these values faced criticism or punishment. A child who adapted quietly was praised. Over time, this created an environment where joy itself became a controlled behavior. Even brief smiles appeared cautiously. Shaped by fear of reprimand, their hours carried no natural pause, no space that encouraged ease. Whatever fragments of joy they experienced had to hide beneath the weight of responsibility. Quiet truth lingered behind those routines, tightening with each year until childhood dissolved into something entirely different from what people now imagine. Religious life in the medieval world placed enormous weight on obedience, fear, and unquestioned devotion. Within that structure, young individuals often became tools for purposes they could not understand. Rituals depended on discipline, authority depended on submission, and communities sought meaning through acts that drew power from symbols rather than compassion. In this environment, childhood offered no protection. The beliefs that shaped entire societies reached into children's lives long before they were old enough to question them. Many were raised under strict systems in which faith was presented as the only acceptable interpretation of existence. They learned rituals before they learned language, repeated prayers before understanding their meaning, and followed expectations enforced through constant supervision. Certain households introduced extreme doctrines to children at an age when they could neither accept nor resist them. These young individuals absorbed fear of punishment, visions of divine judgment, and the idea that suffering held spiritual value. Such teachings blended into their earliest memories, leaving little space for independent thought. Some communities took these expectations further. They believed devotion was strongest when required from the very young, as if purity existed only before maturity could interfere. These beliefs created conditions where children were pushed into roles meant to elevate the status of families or religious leaders. Many were paraded through gatherings as examples of perfect obedience, expected to stand still for long periods or repeat lines rehearsed meticulously. Applause from elders reinforced the notion that their worth came from compliance. Beyond these performances, darker practices persisted. In regions where older traditions survived beneath formal religion, rituals demanded human presence in ways that ignored personal safety. Stories circulated of ceremonies in which children were placed at the center to represent innocence or sacrifice. Their participation was not symbolic to the adults who conducted the rites. Tasks that seemed harmless could escalate into dangerous situations. Some children were positioned near fires, drawn into trance-like states, or placed in physical danger under the belief that divine protection would intervene. A small number faced even more severe outcomes. There were isolated accounts of children being offered in rituals designed to appease forces believed to control weather, crops, or illness. These acts were justified by fear and desperation, not by concern for human life. Families trapped by famine, disease, or war sometimes believed they had no other option. Children too young to understand were led into ceremonies from which they would not return. Communities rationalized these events as necessary, allowing the cycle to continue. Even in more structured religious settings, exploitation occurred in subtler ways. Some institutions discovered that supposed miracles attracted attention and donations. Children were placed at the center of these displays because their expressions appeared sincere and convincing. Reports described cases where a child was instructed to faint, cry, or speak scripted lines to simulate divine influence. These staged events stirred crowds, strengthened authority, and deepened belief, even though the child performing them had no understanding of the consequences. Such manipulation shaped emotional development. A child repeatedly used as proof of supernatural activity began to internalize expectations. They learned to manage their behavior carefully, adjusting posture, on, and expression to satisfy adults who relied on their performance. Over time, they struggled to distinguish genuine emotions from rehearsed reactions. When praise came only after staged events, confusion replaced stability. They learned that value depended on usefulness, not individuality. Pressure also grew within households deeply committed to extreme practices. Parents feared divine punishment for disobedience, leading them to impose rigid rules that blurred the line between spiritual training and psychological control. Children were denied the freedom to explore, question, or express discomfort. They learned to suppress doubts to avoid suspicion. Any sign of hesitation risked reprimand or exclusion. Silence became a survival skill. In communities where illness or misfortune triggered suspicion, children were sometimes blamed. Those who behaved differently, moved awkwardly, or suffered seizures faced accusations of spiritual corruption. Without scientific understanding, families interpreted medical conditions as signs of possession or curses. These children were isolated, restrained, or subjected to painful rituals meant to drive out perceived forces. Many received no comfort, only fear disguised as healing. Even when conditions were less severe, religious structures maintained tight control over behavior. Children attended long ceremonies where standing still for hours was expected. Breaks were rare, and discomfort had to be endured without complaint. Participation required constant focus, preventing any chance of relaxation. Young individuals learned to navigate the environment carefully, aware that mistakes could bring harsh consequences. The psychological impact was profound. Many entered adulthood with memories dominated by fear, pressure, and confusion. Their earliest experiences with faith were shaped by coercion rather than understanding. They carried habits of obedience long after rituals ended, mirroring the systems that shaped them. For some, religious identity became inseparable from suffering. For others, numbness replaced belief altogether. Communities viewed these practices as normal. Survival depended on unity, and unity depended on shared rituals. Questioning those rituals threatened stability. As a result, exploitation persisted quietly, unnoticed by those who believed they were acting responsibly. Adults convinced themselves that they protected their children through these actions, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Tradition held more weight than well-being. Their earliest years unfolded in spaces that demanded complete surrender, leaving no room for genuine discovery. Whatever hopes remained were pressed into prescribed roles that denied them safety. A silent heaviness waited behind every ritual, intensifying as childhood slipped further from reach. Life in medieval communities offered no gentle path through childhood. Each year unfolded under the weight of responsibilities that pressed against young bodies long before they understood their purpose. There were no celebrations to mark the passage of time, no gifts to recognize milestones, and no days set aside for relief. The idea that youth should hold joy or discovery had no place in their world. Survival was the only measure that mattered, and even that was never guaranteed. Every child learned quickly that existence depended on endurance, not growth. Daily routines left little room for sentiment. A newborn entered the world without expectation of reaching adulthood, and families approached childhood with quiet caution. They did not assume survival. They did not plan futures. They watched seasons shift and waited to see who would endure them. Without birthdays or special occasions, age drifted forward without recognition. Childhood existed as a passing stage that blurred into labor before it ever formed a complete identity. Mornings began early, often before sunlight reached the ground. Young individuals rose to the sound of adults preparing for work, knowing they were expected to move just as quickly. Tasks awaited them regardless of weather or fatigue. Carrying water, gathering fuel, tending animals, or assisting in fields filled their hours. No allowances were made for youth. Their bodies adjusted by necessity, not choice. Complaints were discouraged, and rest came only when adults permitted it. The absence of leisure hardened their perception of time. Days stretched under unchanging routines, and weeks passed with little variation. Without holidays or moments of structured pause, the rhythm remained strict. Feasts or festivals that offered relief to adults did not grant the same freedom to children. They assisted with preparation, cleanup, and errands, often working harder during these events than on regular days. Observing joy from a distance became normal. Illness shadowed childhood constantly. The environment offered few protections, and even minor sickness carried risk. Families understood that survival to age 15 marked an unusual achievement. Many never reached that milestone. When a child grew older than expected, the reaction was quiet, not celebratory. Gratitude took the form of increased responsibilities. Living longer meant working more, contributing more, and receiving less leniency. Adulthood arrived not through choice but through necessity. The emotional impact grew slowly and quietly, without gifts, rewards, or moments designed for happiness. Children learned to measure worth through endurance. They understood that suffering was expected and that survival proved strength. Expressions of vulnerability drew disapproval or silence. Emotional comfort rarely appeared. Adults had little energy to spare. Hardship passed through generations as an unspoken inheritance. Families did not neglect their children intentionally. Their circumstances left little room for softness. Food scarcity, disease, and unpredictable weather shaped priorities. Every resource had to support the survival of the group rather than the comfort of individuals. Childhood could not be sheltered because adults themselves lived without security. As a result, children entered adulthood not with memories of joy, but with a long record of endurance. Structures within communities reinforced these expectations. Religious leaders spoke of discipline as a virtue. Elders repeated lessons about toughness, obedience, and duty. Public opinion rewarded stoicism. A child who worked silently earned approval, while one who hesitated risked criticism. Over time, this environment erased any distinction between hardship and normalcy. What might appear severe to modern perspectives seemed ordinary to them. Even moments of small relief contained tension. A child who paused briefly risked being called back to work. A child who smiled too widely risked seeming unserious. Any activity that might resemble rest was monitored carefully. Young individuals learned to control their bodies, limit expression, and move with constant awareness. Their energy, instead of flowing into curiosity or creativity, flowed into caution. Growing older did not lighten this pressure. As they approached adolescence, responsibilities multiplied. Adults expected competence, speed, and endurance. Mistakes became less tolerated. Those who managed to survive past early childhood did so through a combination of resilience and circumstance. They carried the understanding that survival required continuous effort. They did not anticipate rewards or recognition. They simply continued. Death remained present in every household. Children witnessed loss regularly and learned not to react strongly. Mourning had limits because daily tasks could not stop. A child who lived through these cycles absorbed the message that life was temporary and that endurance was the only stable requirement. This understanding shaped their identities long after childhood ended. In such a world, growth did not represent opportunity. It meant heavier burdens, longer hours, and greater expectations. Adolescence brought no celebration, only increased labor. The shift from childhood to adulthood happened quietly, without ceremony. One day, a child realized that play no longer existed, rest no longer appeared, and the responsibilities now matched those of the adults standing beside them. No one questioned these conditions because they had no alternative frame of reference. Medieval life demanded labor from all members of a household, and children were simply the youngest contributors. Hardship remained constant and predictable. The absence of joy did not feel unusual because joy had never been present. Their years passed under steady pressure, leaving little room for innocence to take root. Whatever hopes might have softened their days faded beneath constant demands. Shadows of endurance settled early, tightening with each season until youth became indistinguishable from duty. Life in medieval society unfolded in an environment where childhood carried no promise of gentleness. Each year began and ended under conditions shaped by hardship, illness, and rigid expectations. Young individuals entered a world already burdened by scarcity, and their earliest memories formed within spaces that demanded obedience rather than exploration. Pain, loss, and fear became familiar companions long before they understood their meaning. There was no system to protect them, no structure designed to support their emotional needs. They adapted because adaptation was the only available path. From birth onward, the fragility of existence remained clear. Families approached early childhood with caution, understanding that survival could not be assumed. Infants and young children lived through cycles of sickness, hunger, and exposure without the benefit of medical knowledge or reliable care. Many never reached adolescence. Those who did carried the weight of constant uncertainty. Their understanding of life centered not on possibility, but on endurance. The emotional landscape surrounding them offered few sources of comfort. Adults did not ask children what they wanted or how they felt. Needs were acknowledged only when they affected work or survival. Silence replaced conversation, and expectations replaced curiosity. The absence of nurturing did not result from cruelty, but from constraints. Families struggling to meet basic needs lacked resources to consider emotional well-being. Children learned to suppress fear and sadness because expressing either brought no relief. Daily routines did not allow moments for reflection. Tasks are filled every hour, shaping identities around contribution rather than individuality. A young person who hesitated risked reprimand or punishment. The rules governing behavior remained strict because communities relied on discipline to maintain order. Few individuals questioned these norms. Hardship passed through generations without challenge, solidifying beliefs about duty, suffering, and silence. Loss appeared regularly and reshaped families without warning. Childhood deaths were common. When one child disappeared from the household, routines continued with little disruption because survival allowed no pause. Siblings grew up watching funerals that occurred without ceremony. Their understanding of grief developed around observation rather than comfort. Death became a normal part of daily experience. As familiar as hunger or fatigue, fear also persisted in more subtle forms. Religious authority, community pressure, and parental expectations created an atmosphere where mistakes carried consequences. Children learned early to avoid drawing attention, to move quietly, and to complete tasks without error. The threat of punishment shaped their movements and thoughts. Over time, this constant vigilance hardened into habit. They lived with a sense of tension that never fully eased. Even in adulthood, opportunities for joy were minimal. Laughter appeared briefly, slipping into days structured by labor and supervision. Play existed only in narrow fragments, and even those fragments carried risk. When joy surfaced, it had no lasting space to grow. The environment demanded restraint. Children adapted to this requirement until it became part of their identity. The social structures surrounding them reinforced the idea that suffering held value. Endurance was praised, submission was rewarded, and obedience defined moral character. Childhood did not provide a separate stage of life with its own qualities or protections. It functioned instead as preparation for labor. Even before reaching maturity, young individuals adopted responsibilities that consumed their time and energy. They entered adulthood not with celebration, but with resignation. The absence of choice shaped their trajectory. A child had no voice in determining their work, role, beliefs, or future. Their path was decided long before they developed an understanding of their own desires. By the time they reached an age where questioning might have occurred, the patterns of life were already solidified. They repeated the same routines their parents once learned, carrying forward a cycle that seemed unbreakable. In many ways, the darkness surrounding medieval childhood did not come from a single source. It came from a combination of poverty, illness, limited knowledge, harsh labor, and unchallenged beliefs. Each factor reinforced the others, creating an environment where hardship felt inevitable. Even individuals who wanted gentler lives for their children lacked the means to create them. Hope struggled to exist in conditions that allowed little room for it. Yet survival itself left marks that shaped adulthood. Those who reached maturity carried memories of losses that never faded, fears that never fully disappeared, and responsibilities that never loosened their grip. They lived through their youth, learning to endure, adapt, and remain silent. These habits continued into adulthood and influenced how they raised their own families. They passed forward the same expectations, convinced that hardship was natural. The cycle repeated quietly, generation after generation. A child who survived to 15 had endured more than many adults today experience in a lifetime. Their bodies carried signs of exhaustion, their minds carried the weight of discipline, and their emotions remained carefully controlled. They understood life through struggle, not choice. Their growth did not resemble development, but the accumulation of duties, pressures, and silent fears. The contrast between what childhood means now and what childhood meant then reveals the magnitude of their burden. Modern expectations of safety, education, care, and joy did not exist. Medieval society offered none of these assurances. Instead, it carved childhood into a narrow space defined by necessity. Through that narrow space walked children who learned to expect nothing beyond survival. As this long journey reaches its end, the image that remains is stark. Youth did not function as a protected period. It operated as an early apprenticeship in hardship. Each child stepped into the world surrounded by shadows, and most remained there for the rest of their lives. The darkness came not from cruelty alone, but from conditions that prevented anything brighter from forming. Their earliest memories contained more burden than comfort, pressing into years shaped by endurance. Whatever strength they carried into adulthood emerged from hardship rather than hope. Quiet weight settled across every season, deepening until youth faded into responsibility without leaving space for light. Thank you for listening to this final chapter. May your night be gentle, may your rest be long, and may your dreams carry you somewhere far from the shadows of this history. Good night.